Around science and revolutionary praxis debate with the Union of Communists for the construction of the party. It's been several years since the MAI launched its open letter to the whole of the revolutionary vanguard, aimed primarily at the Maoist component of the proletarian vanguard in the Spanish state. Although we were aware of the minority of this sector through these latitudes, the MAI considered, and continues to do so, Maoism as the most advanced expression of revolutionary theory during the past cycle, and a privileged point of support from which to undertake the necessary balance of the October cycle, and the Maoists, always insistent on the question of ideological definition, as the best predisposed actors to understand a proposal that was aimed precisely at ideological clarification and the vivification and foundation of revolutionary principles. Unfortunately, Maoism demonstrated the reason why its influence in the Spanish state is so limited. Even despite their isolation, most of the groups were not even aware, and those who did showed their enormous political and, above all, ideological deficiencies. We have had plenty of time since then to reaffirm ourselves in these ideas and draw a clear conclusion. The greatest enemies of the expansion of Maoism in the Spanish state are the Maoists themselves of the place. For our part, we will continue to pay attention to the controversy within the international Maoist movement, because in that area you can find coherence and debates of substance. Likewise, we will continue to support his left wing against the opportunistic and liquidationist drifts that threaten the dismissing conquests that this current has offered to the World Proletarian Revolution, RPM, in the same way that we will continue with our support of those Maoists who continue to raise the flag of the People's War in its practical application. However, life is never unilateral, and the balance is far from being entirely negative. First of all, in addition to showing the character of local Maoism, the Open Charter has nourished and enriched the Reconstitution line, especially with regard to the general line of the RPM and specifically with regard to the problems of the People's War as a universal revolutionary strategy of the proletariat, giving it a greater foundation and inserting it in the hot issues of the struggle of lines in the Spanish state. In addition, the Open Charter has provoked the response of other sectors of the avant-garde, even if they are not for those that were originally thought, who have reacted more positively and constructively to our proposal. One of these answers comes from the Union of Communists for the Construction of the Party, UCCP, whose response we will deal with in this document, in addition to positioning ourselves with some implications that derive from the line expressed in its documents. A debate between comrades. The comrades of the UCCP sent us their partial assessment of the open letter in a document entitled The Lotus Flower and the Vanguard Allocata, which we reproduce following this work, dated May 2011. First of all, we must apologize to the comrades in the delay of the response, due to the internal needs of our organization and the compulsion of other obligations imposed by our political plan. However, it can be said that the delay is not a particularly serious fault in the era in which we live, marked by the defeat of the First World attempt of the proletarian revolution, with the consequent inability of communists in most of the world, especially in imperialist countries, to intervene substantively in social and political reality. For better and for worse, the divorce between the avant-garde and the masses objectively marks different political times for each of the constitutive parts of the proletariat as a political subject. As important as the political speed of the vanguard must be its care when it comes to making and substantiating its arguments, because it is in that field that we mainly risk the fate of the development of the revolutionary proletarian movement in the coming decades. On the other hand, the delay in the response has allowed us to know in greater depth the positions of the comrades of the UCCP through various documents that they have been publishing since then, which, without a doubt, has helped us to form a better and more complete opinion about the line that those works express. The work of the UCCP to which we refer above begins with what we could call self-criticism in light of its long political trajectory. In it, a correct critique is made of the voluntarist relationship with Marxism that has traditionally manifested itself between the avant-garde and the contempt for the theory that has dominated it, something that, we agree with the comrades, has been especially true in the Spanish case. This exercise of self-criticism, fully consistent with the tradition of the communist movement, and which usually shines by its absence among its current and alleged representatives, says a lot about the spirit of the comrades of the UCCP and their willingness to constructive debate. Go ahead, then, our recognition of the comrades and our willingness to frame the debate within mutual respect and good forms, without this being in prejudice of the development of criticism and the struggle of two lines, and all its breadth, as demanded by Marxism and demands the sector of the vanguard most sensitive to the problems of the Reconstitution. Throughout this work we are going to emphasize the fundamental differences that separate us from the UCCP. Of course, this should not be understood as an attack on comrades, or as anything that hides destructive intentions towards them. For too long, revisionism has dominated among the communist vanguard movement in this and many other countries. It is not surprising, then, that he has imposed his calm and liberal style of work when it comes to understanding how relations between communists should be structured. We have seen too many processes of unity and joint communications that only emphasized what was common among their signatories and that left ideological differences either for secret treatment in clique meetings or to be smoothed out by that fetish, the practice, to which so much is appealed and from which so little is learned. Of course, on most occasions these processes of convergence have ended up like the rosary of the aurora, failing and filling the horizon of the communist movement with blacks and demoralizing omens regarding the possibility of re-raising that communist party that the proletariat needs so much. This has been due both to the fundamental revisionist conceptions that guide most of the groups that bet on communist unity as the way of constitution of the party, and to the style of work that this conception, more concerned about the liberal agreement, imposes, where ideology is understood as one more marketing product, and not as the fundamental premise of the proletarian revolutionary project. From the opposite conception, which defends the Reconstitution line, there is no place for these velleities. Revolutionary theory is not an uncomfortable stumbling block that prevents us from practical unity, but it is the key to the revolutionary building. There is no room for it, therefore, its secret or exclusivist treatment by the directorates, but divergences are something that must be openly exposed, both for the development of the theory itself, from the confrontation and struggle of lines, and for the elevation of more and more sectors of the vanguard to a position from which they can understand and participate in these debates, which are an essential basis for the formation of those tribunes of the people that must be the communist militants. Therefore, that a single communist is interested in these debates and wants to develop them is worth, in the current circumstances that our movement is going through, more than hundreds of joint communiques of diverse groups or than dozens of aborted unity processes. That is why the open, serious, and substantiated treatment of fundamental differences is so important at the current moment and is the line of action, totally opposite to the one established by revisionism, on which we bet. As we said, that self-criticism serves the comrades to link their trajectory with their current political stage, exposing some of the recurring concepts that, in our opinion, nuclei their current political line. The ideological break with the previous stage is not completed until we understand in its breadth a fact of capital importance. The theoretical training comprises two tasks that complement each other. The task of the study cannot be detached from the theoretical practice, understood as scientific practice linked to the needs of the class struggle of the historical moment. And also, we must produce the concept of the current reality, of the concrete conditions in which we act, that is, the analysis of social formation and the political analysis of the classes in struggle. We have highlighted these two concepts: theoretical practice and production of the concept of reality, or, which is a synonym for comrades, production of the knowledge of reality, intimately intertwined with each other, and, as we will have the opportunity to verify, recurring in the documents of the UCCP, and that, it seems to us, form the core of his conception of Marxism and, consequently, of his vision of the character of the tasks faced by the avant-garde. True to our commitment to the theoretical debate, it has seemed fundamental to us to investigate the origins of these concepts, irretrievably encountering what, we understand, is one of the main sources of inspiration for our comrades, the French philosopher and thinker Louis Althusser. It seems appropriate to us, both to better understand the conceptions of our comrades and to place this debate in the long historical context, also in the face of that balance that we propose to the forefront, to give a few brushstrokes, no matter how succinct and schematic they may be, about the thought of this author and his position, undoubtedly important, in the Marxism of the second half of the 20th century. Althusser, or the echoes of a ghost. To understand Althusser, as Marxists, we must frame him in his socio-historical context. Althusser begins to stand out among the ranks of the intellectuality attached to Marxism in the early 1960s. It is a time when the International Communist Movement, ICM, has just been shaken by the XX Congress of the CPSU of 1956, which, unlike what many communists have traditionally understood, was not the cause of the ICM crisis, but a consequence of it, the explosion of the contradictions that had been living within the MCI and the USSR for several decades. As is known, the XX Congress did not provide a solution to this crisis, but, hand in hand with the new Soviet bourgeoisie, it channeled it towards the restoration of capitalism in the USSR, announcing the dissolution of the socialist camp and the decomposition of the MCI. The XX Congress was the trumpet so that the most stark revisionism took control of most of the parties that made up the MCI. Again here, as in the USSR, that was nothing but the confirmation of the victory of a revisionism that had been consolidating within these parties for a long time. It is here that the peaceful transition to socialism and the new socialist humanism is definitively imposed, which were nothing but the definitive triumph of parliamentary cretinism, already thriving since the time of the popular fronts and liberalism in the bosom of the communist parties. It is at this moment of exacerbation of the crisis that the figure of Althusser begins to stand out. Academic of late affiliation to the French Communist Party, PCF, Althusser collects a long orthodox tradition of Marxism, which is that of the scientific positivist understanding of it, at the same time that he raises his voice, from the theoretical level, against some excesses of the XX Congress. Here it is possible to frame his theoretical anti-humanism, which in turn links with the academic fashions of France of the time, marked by the rise of structuralism. The ultimate purpose of the human sciences is not to constitute man, but to dissolve him, Levi Strauss Dixit, while, at the same time, he remained framed in the majority pro-Soviet current of the MCI, not abandoning the PCF, and, even as an enfant terrible, assuming most of his positions. All this ambiguous positioning, at the intersection of several ideological and political currents, is what catapulted him to be for a certain time the fashionable philosopher of Marxism, followed at the same time by currents opposing each other. As is known, Althusser's basic thesis is that Marx has inaugurated a new science, the science of history, from the epistemological rupture with the previous ideological problem. That is, Marxist science arises from the break with the set of theoretical problems entangled in previous ideological conceptions. Althusser uses the concept of ideology in a pejorative way, as false consciousness. In this rupture, that theoretical practice, understood as scientific practice, which allows to move from a first generality, that of the reigning ideological conceptions, to a third generality, that of the new science, would play a fundamental role. Theoretical practice would form, along with the theoretical means of production, the second generality, which serves as mediation between these two stages. In this way, science appears as a self-sufficient element, which is self-sufficient for its development, from the criticism and expansion of its own conceptual apparatus, without a substantial relationship with the social or historical context that favors it. In this way, Althusser's scientificism, positivist understanding of science, and reduction to it of all forms of valid consciousness, takes to the end the logical consequences of all positivism. It maintains an external relationship, typical of bourgeois thought, between consciousness and reality, to the extreme of giving each of these elements its own categories that remain ironically separated. Thus, in his criticism of historicism, Althusser will say of this one that reduces the theoretical object of the science of history to real history, confuses, therefore, the object of knowledge with the real object. It should be noted that precisely what the science of history produces, through theoretical practice, is its own concept, its own object of knowledge, which is irreducible, against what Marxism teaches, to an intellectual representation of real history. But there are not even, for the French, franchable borders between the two, between history and its concept, which is what science is concerned with. We never get out of abstraction, that is, knowledge, of the products of thought and conceiving. We never get out of the concept. We never cross, at any time, the absolutely insurmountable border that separates the development or specification from the concept of development and the particularity of things. This border is by right impassable because it is not the border of anything, because it cannot be a border, because there is no common homogeneous space, spirit or real, between the abstract of the concept of a thing and the empirical concrete of this thing that can authorize the use of the concept of border. Logically, this radical separation between abstract consciousness and the concrete real is coupled with a basic idea that runs through Althusser's work, that of the independence of science from its social and historical context, self-absorbed in its own problems and naively seen as absolutely progressive, in coherence with the French Enlightened tradition. A real phenomenon, which needs other categories to be thought, but that must be thought of, distinguishing the relatively autonomous and typical history of scientific knowledge from the other modalities of historical existence. This vision that will remain unscathed despite the successive self-criticism of the Frenchman, aimed at granting in his theory a place to the practice and the social context of the class struggle, unsuccessfully trying to smooth out the theoricism that Althusser himself will recognize. The key to that permanent theorism is Althusser's misunderstanding of the role of the subject in history that, faithful to his objectivism and structuralist fashion, he tries to directly banish. The story is of process without subject or ends, he will say in his response to John Lewis, who acts as the first part of his self-criticism. Thus, knowledge is an impersonal process that goes parallel to another impersonal process, history itself. That allows him to continue placing scientific practice as a superior or more elaborate form of practice, ignoring what undoubtedly occupies that place for Marxism, which is revolutionary practice or revolutionary praxis, the organic, internal fusion of theory and practice in the conscious transformation of the world. This misunderstanding is still a reflection of Althusser's own position, a militant academic in a revisionist party, PCF, a party that has long abandoned any claim to adjust its bourgeois, economicist parliamentary practice with the revolutionary theory and maintains a liberal entente with the prestigious intellectuality of the party, which has allowed free theorization as long as it does not interfere in the party's policy, fiercely directed by a technocratic apparatchik of parliamentarians, and observes it as a predetermined external process. The theoretical expression of this misunderstanding of the relationship between subject, currently reduced by Althusser to the individual man to make it easier to discard, and object, which in reality form a material unit in mutual determination, and that is precisely what makes Marx's dialectical materialism definitively superior with respect to the past, mechanistic forms, of the same. The understanding of the subjective aspect of matter will be his criticism and minimization of dialectics. But the ML has always subjected dialectical theses to the primacy of materialistic theses. Althusser presents us with Marxist philosophy, in line with structuralist ethos, as a series of compartmentalized and independent levels, some of which we can tide without affecting the rest of the structure, to make one. Of course, this is manifestly wrong from the point of Marxism, for which dialectics and materialism form an interpenetrated whole. One is divided into two, impossible to separate under penalty of breaking the entire building, which is what, as we will see, will happen to Althusser's dialectical materialism. There is no need, then, for the understanding of dialectical materialism, even if it is based on the previous development of materialism. Nothing is born out of nowhere, and the new arises from the old, as a conventional materialism to which is capriciously added, as if it were salt, a dose of dialectic, but it is a new and integral form, qualitatively different and superior, of materialism. This contempt and misunderstanding of dialectics continues in the second part of his self-criticism. The target this time is the category of denial, which, from our own experience, as the readers of El Martinique will know, appears to us more and more as the philosophical battlefield between a dialectical understanding of Marxism or its positivist reduction. As is known, Maoism has abandoned, with honorable exceptions, the use of this category, but its misunderstanding extends through the rest of the traditions of the MCI, which, after all, share philosophical substrate, positivism, and historical cradle, the cycle, with Maoism. Althusser is particularly expressive. Here I let you suspect what can happen to a dialectic abandoned to the absolute delirium of the denial of denial. It is a dialectic that produces its own spheres of existence. It is, to say it brutally, a dialectic that produces its own matter. Thesis that faithfully transposes and translates the fundamental thesis of bourgeois ideology. It is the work of the capitalist that produces capital. As we see, the incomprehension of the subject, its subsumption into a predetermined structure, leads him to vehemently reject this category. From the point of view of Marxist materialism, it is true that the subjects are determined by the structure, but Althusser forgets that, in turn, that structure has been formed by the subject, which is also something material. Let's remember again the first thesis on Feuerbach and his criticism of old materialism for not understanding reality as something also subjective. This forces him to surreptitiously and cheatfully introduce the individual capitalist in parentheses to make the ingenious finish fit into his scheme. But it is enough to remove the parenthesis to understand that, indeed, capital has been created by work. In fact, it is nothing other than objectified past work. What is really useful to bourgeois ideology is the representation of capital as a historical natural entity, absolutely decisive, and to whose laws the subjects must submit. And lately the proletarians of this country have heard a lot of the Thatcherian "there is no alternative," which, in addition, beyond that overwhelming solvent objectivity, do not even exist. Not to mention the consequences, in the face of the revolution, of denying the delirium of a dialectic that creates matter itself. Where then is the Leninist thesis of revolutionary theory as the basis of the Communist Party? Isn't this a material revolutionary subject that is not given by the immanent laws of the social process, but that we have to create, that is, build consciously? Obviously, the consequences of the dialectical deficit in their basic understanding of Marxism, along with their scientific objectivism, will not be long in coming when it comes to manifesting in their understanding of the class struggle and politics, but beware of idealism. The class struggle does not unfold in the air. This deep truth has been expressed by the ML in the well-known thesis of the class struggle in infrastructure, in the economy, in the exploitation of classes, and in the thesis of the intertwinkling of all forms of class struggle in the economic class struggle. With this condition, the revolutionary thesis of the primacy of the class struggle is materialistic. Here we have blatantly expressed the political consequences of scientism and objectivism, the reduction of all materiality to the objective process of the economy, and the unionist economicism elevated to non plus ultra of the class struggle. Contravening the most basic theses of Marxism that point out that the class struggle is always a political struggle, manifesto of the Communist Party, being politics, concentrated of the economy, Lenin, the true central place of all class struggle. The submersion of the subject in the ocean of material objectivity, and in this Althusser is, in spite of him, much more Hegelian than that disciple of Hegel named Karl Marx, leads, in the face of the revolutionary tasks of the proletariat, to dissolve the party in the Union. In his Elements of Self-Criticism, Althusser recognizes that his leitmotif was the search for arguments for materialism, which, Spinoza through, leads him to nominalism. That is, his contempt for dialectics, limited to contradiction, but ignoring the form of movement that generates this contradiction, precisely the denial of negation, leads him to retreat to the most primitive forms of materialism. And it is that indeed, Marx pointed out that nominalism had been a first manifestation of materialism. However, in the face of the appearance of superior forms, not only the French mechanistic materialism of the 18th century, but, above all, dialectical materialism, the appeal to it, also as an excuse to banish dialectics, can be no less than regressive. And that's what happens to Althusser. As is known, nominalism as a defined current of thought arises in the late Middle Ages in the context of the discussion around the universals, as a reaction to the scholastic excesses in that debate. The fundamental thesis of nominalism is that the universal only exists as a name, but that it is unattainable in the things themselves, which are, by nature, totally unique and different from each other. That is, reality is a multiplicity of singularities, being generality only as abstraction in the mind and speech of the observer. Althusser, at the end of his life, will openly recognize his affiliation to that philosophy. Didn't Marx affirm that nominalism is the prelude to materialism? Precisely, and I would go further. I would say that it is not only the anteroom, but it is already materialism. Thus, the world is made exclusively of unique things, each designable by its own name and its properties. Indeed, and despite the academic vision that Althusser embraced nominalism at the end of his career, we can affirm that this philosophical conception is the one that presides over his entire Marxist work. It is worth remembering that passage that we have mentioned above, where he speaks of the insurmountable border between the empirical concrete and the abstract of the concept of a thing, which justifies his self-absorbed conception of science as something that advances autonomously from the development of its own concepts. However, Marx's dialectical materialism had already discarded that point of view, and had affirmed that the abstract universal can have a practical concrete form of existence, exemplifying it in the form that work takes in capitalist society. Indifference to a certain genre of work implies a very developed totality of real genres of work, none of which predominates over the others. Thus, the most general abstractions arise only where the richest concrete development exists, where an element appears as the common to many, as common to all elements. This abstraction of work in general is not only the intellectual result of a specific totality of works. Indifference for a particular job corresponds to a form of society in which individuals can easily move from one job to another, and in which the given gender of work is for them fortuitous and, therefore, indifferent. Work has then become, not only in terms of category, but also in reality, the medium to create wealth in general, and, as a determination, it has ceased to adhere to the individual as a particularity of its own. Here, then, the abstraction of the category work, the work in general, the work sans phrase, which is the starting point of the modern economy, is for the first time practically true. The naive scientific optimism, of which the French was nothing more than the last and most stretched expression, was bankrupt with the wrestlers of the October cycle, which if anything has meant its end, with respect to philosophies such as the Althusserian, is a mentis of the objectivist irreversibility of material development, and an inverted manifestation of the power and existence of the subject, inverted because the world that we have had to live, this interregnum between two revolutionary cycles, is nothing more than the result of the debacle and the disintegration of the revolutionary subject, the MCI, which cries for its reconstitution. To end up with Althusser, loosened the Dogel who imposed his affiliation to communism with that decomposition of the MCI. He adapted perfectly to the new intellectual times of postmodernity. The rigid Althusserian objectivism mutated, in a logical and necessary way, into its perfect opposite, an unbridled subjectivism, because nothing else is that random materialism that the Frenchman raised in his last years. I think that the true materialism, the one that best suits Marxism, is random materialism, inscribed in the line of Democritus and Epicurus. This materialism, in full accordance with the bourgeois scientific paradigm, and that is that Althusser never renounced his scientism. Proof of this is the persistence of his nominalism. He simply subjectivized it in his last era, reduces all matter to primitive, uncreated, and eternal entities. All the elements of the world already existed isolated, since always, from all eternity, before there was a world. The consequence of this singularization and randomness, by taking it to the field of the development of human societies, to the field of history, is the segmentation, the atomization of the process of social development, the conjuncturization of history. Conjuncture means conjunction, that is, random encounter of elements partly existing but also unpredictable. Every conjuncture is a singular case, like all historical individualities, like everything that exists. What, in turn, consequently, leads to the denial of the existence of historical laws. A true materialistic conception of history implies the abandonment of the idea that history is governed and dominated by laws that it is enough to know and respect to succeed over anti-history. It must be said, first of all, that this vision of historical laws pre-existing to the action of the subject, that it is enough to know and respect, is absolutely foreign to Marxism, since it liquidates the need for revolution of, to paraphrase Marx, practical critical activity, organically intertwined in the process of knowledge. No, this position, which is rather part of neo-Kantism, is not that of dialectical materialism, but the one that Althusser himself vehemently encouraged in his time of communist militancy, the positivist reduction of Marxism. 23. In any case, for this new materialism we are talking about, history is nothing more than the random combination of pre-existing historical individualities, none of which can be considered superior to the others. Denied the historical laws, which, of course, are not, nor is Marxism defended, comparable to physical laws, that is, the possibility of understanding and rationalizing the historical process as a whole. The next logical step is the denial of the progressive development of the course of history, the coincidence of it and the enthronization of historical relativism, the equal nature and respectability of all historical forms, a very fashionable conception and defended by postmodern historiography. The political consequence is evident: denial of planning and consciousness and political activity, the denigration of the avant-garde, and the enthronement of the conjuncture and the random aggregation of irreducible individualities and subjectivities in the multitude, a novel terminology to designate a political fact as old as the labor movement, the embellishment and exaltation of spontaneity. This is precisely the political creed of the Althusserian disciples who approach social movements, new deconstruction, atomist and conjuncturist, of the proletarian subject, and, in general, that of all Marxists who have become postmodern. And it is that the transition from stony scientificism to the liquid randomness is nothing more than the expression of the time in Althusser. The passage, in the intellectual world, from rigid objectivist structuralism to subjectivist post-structuralism, the passage from modernity to postmodernity. This, in turn, is the expression of the failure of the illustrated project of the proletariat, the result of the interweaving of the thunder of the bourgeois revolution and the beginning of the RPM. The naive consecration of science as an absolute ally of the proletariat and the belief that the objective laws of history, pre-existing to the historical subject and that it is enough to know and respect, automatically and inevitably led to progress, to socialism. All of which has collapsed, precisely, with the end of the October cycle, whose thunderous end resounding in that way among the new philosophers, many of them, old Althussians, that they devoted their energies to the relentless deconstruction of modernity. By the way, although postmodernity has been used by the bourgeoisie, in the midst of the hecatomb of real socialism, to promote historical relativism and proceed to the deconstruction of the proletariat and the banishment of the revolution of the intellectual world, it is not good for the communists to deny it, as the majority of the MCI does, because that is to ignore what the postmodernity of expression of a real fact has, the end of the October cycle and the expiration of many of the conceptions instruments that the proletariat used during that historical experience, and it is, therefore, to deny us to understand the time we have had to live. As we say, postmodernity is not worth denying it, in the sense of rejecting all the undoubtedly reactionary conceptions it has brought with it, but, as good dialectics, we must deny denial, and incorporate what is certainly positive about it. Such as, for example, its criticism of the illustrated fetish of automatic and impersonal progress. Only at that moment will we be in a position to win the ideological battle over the bourgeoisie and reverse its current hegemony, which, without a doubt, will be the expression of the growing maturity of the proletariat as a revolutionary subject, an index of the advanced degree of its process of reconstitution. In short, the communist militant Althusser of the 60s and 70s of the last century only represents the last orthodox attempt, in the indicated sense of imbrication in the dominant positivist current in Marxism since the Second International, to rescue Marxism from its crisis, but, sadly, playing, without leaving, in the same field as what he criticized. Scientific objectivism opposed to humanist subjectivism, which, in reality, only managed to open the exclusions and accelerate the sinking of The ship. In our opinion, the usefulness of knowing Althusser for today's conscious proletarians is the opposite. It represents a good photographic negative that warns us of the nefarious consequences for Marxist theory and the proletarian revolution to which positivism and scientificism inevitably lead, and therefore, in addition to knowing better some of the presumable influences of our comrades, it has seemed appropriate to dedicate a more or less wide space to it. These consequences are, in the first place, the epistemologization of Marxism, its reduction from an element of transformation to a tool of knowledge, and, consequently, the prioritization of the problems related to it over those that concern it. Secondly, the understanding of science as a neutral element and independent of the rest of the spheres of society, and particularly of the class struggle. Thirdly, the reduction of dialectical materialism to vulgar materialism, which prevents us from understanding consciousness and society as particular forms of matter. And let's remember how random materialism pronounces that all the elements of the world already existed isolated before there was a world, which prevents us from giving an account of these new phenomena, and, consequently, denies the development of matter, the dialectical appearance of new and original forms of it from the old ones. In addition, this reduction is also expressed in the inability to understand historical development as a totalizing and necessary phenomenon, consequently leading to a fragmentary understanding of reality, to its particularization and disintegration into autonomous capsules. Thus, the materialistic monism that is Marxism becomes, and there Althusser consciously points, into dualism. Finally, as a culmination that encompasses and is closely related to others, the outsourcing of consciousness regarding matter, reduced to a mere reflection of it, which incapacitates us to understand what is the central concept of Marxism and the true most elaborate form of practice, revolutionary praxis. The fundamental political consequence of this divorce is the consideration of the vanguard, the social consciousness of the proletariat, as an element foreign to the true working class and the imperative of its submission to the spontaneous, economic movement of this, something that we have seen eloquently expressed by Althusser, and that dominates the communist movement mostly, being the most obvious expression of its defeat and impotence. Entering the debate with the UCCP, of science and praxis as we said, Althusser has served us as a paradigmatic introduction, as an exemplary example of where scientism inevitably leads, of the necessary link, both unilaterally and anti-dialectically, of objectivism and subjectivism, as well as the thread that he logically carries from one to the other, and also to prove that they behave on the philosophical plane in an identical way to right-wing opportunism and leftism on the political level. Like the two sides of the same coin. In addition, referring to the balance of the October cycle, it has helped us to place Althusser, just at the moment when he exploits the long-larved crisis within the MCI, as the manifestation, stretched to the caricature, of that positivist conception that has dominated Marxism since the Second International, and how, beyond personal intentions, paying attention precisely to the impact and influence, certainly great, of his work in an entire sector of the MCI of the time, even pretending to restore a serious theoretical treatment of Marxism, it paved the way for its complete postmodern dissolution, until leaving us in the current situation. But without further ado, let's listen to the actual conceptions of our comrades of the UCCP. We will soon see that this introduction around the work of the French intellectual has not been idle. The comrades recognize the existence of a crisis of Marxism, the end of a whole period, and the need to start a new stage. Of course, only this already puts them ahead of the vast majority of the MCI in general, and its Spanish detachments in particular, which stubbornly refuse to understand this unappealable fact, which leads them to the attempt to apply spent recipe tables and, consequently, to political impotence, as the current situation of deep capitalist crisis is demonstrating. However, immediately the comrades of the UCCP demonstrate their affiliation to that positivist theoretical tradition that we point out, describing Marxism as the scientific theory that allows to produce, through study and social practice, the concept of capitalist production, the knowledge of society governed by capitalist relations of production and their transformation through the class struggle. This assimilation, reduction, we would say, from Marxism to science is something very frequent and on which the comrades insist a lot in their documents. In fact, it is the point since his explanation of the crisis of Marxism is articulated. We have already said it on other occasions. The crisis of Marxism is the crisis of its development as a science, both in the theoretical and practical field. In this sense, Marxism cannot be conceived as something alien to the laws that govern nature, to the dialectic, to the struggle of the opposites, which advances to the extent that its revolutionary and scientific side dominates its other revisionist and ideological side, influenced by the metaphysical and economicist conception of the bourgeoisie. The UCCP shows us Marxism as a unit of opposites, having in one pole, the revolutionary, to science, and in the other aspect, the revisionist, to ideology. As we can see, they introduce us to a problem of clear Althussian cut, which in addition, as we have pointed out above, reminds of the first Althusser, prior to his unsuccessful self-criticisms, in which Marxism advances to the extent that science banishes ideology. And vice versa, its crisis is the product of its phagocytation by the ideological, nefarious, and revisionist element. Despite the introduction of the word practice in its formulation, the best thing that can be said of this conception is that here practice appears as a secondary element, being the fundamental of the explanation. The game of the theoretical elements, science versus ideology, to each other, self-absorbed. In fact, the UCCP seems to confirm this extreme when it states, the theoretical production, understood as a result of theoretical practice, cannot be conceived as a result of a cycle in which organizations mechanically adhere to the revolutionary process by ideological identification and political concordance to the historical context, but to an institutionalized theoretical activity of the avant-garde that aspires to build communist society. We had already pointed out at the beginning of this work that the comrades identified, in the Althusserian line, theoretical practice with scientific practice. We have seen that for them the development of Marxism is equivalent to primacy and development of its scientific side over the ideological, and now we are going to see how this is reflected on the communist militancy itself. The transformation of the will into a revolutionary act is part of a process in which it must dominate the theoretical aspect about the ideological and militant activity. Therefore, we can see how the scheme in which the development of Marxism is equivalent to the development of its scientific aspect in front of its ideological aspect, is reflected in the militant aspect in the predominance of the theoretical over the ideological. Thus, consequently, we can choose that in the conception of comrades, theory is equivalent to science. And we have, as we have just seen, that theoretical production, that is, scientific, is the result of theoretical practice. It is thus understood that, for the UCCP, the development of the theory is the result of an intra-theoretical process, of the self-absorption of science with itself. In fact, the comrades themselves are responsible for explicitly banishing, by mechanical, the influence of any historical or political cycle in its conformation. With this, we keep in mind one of the clear symptoms of any scientific reduction of Marxism, the independence of science, its relative autonomy, as Althusser would say, with respect to the other spheres of society, especially the class struggle. Its autonomous discourse from the development of its own concepts, we have already seen at the beginning of this document, and we will have the opportunity to continue to check it, as the mission that these comrades assign to theoretical practice. Scientific is to produce the concept of reality. The Althusserian hangovers of this conception are more than evident. Precisely the French, when understanding science independent of the social process as a neutral form of knowledge, needed to adhere, that is, to attach externally and mechanically, ideology as a practical instrument of science, although not necessarily intertwined in it, without entering into the problem of the relations of science with its ideological past. We can say that ideology as a system of representations is distinguished from science in that the practical social function is more important than the theoretical, or knowledge, function. And our comrades of the UCCP take up this problem by pointing out that theoretical practice, in addition to producing the knowledge of social reality, the theoretical elements to understand its structure and the laws that determine its development in order to transform it, produces the ideological elements to establish the ideological class struggle, a necessary condition for a correct mass line, that is, appropriate to the concrete reality. With this, we have the complete picture. It is theoretical practice, science, the source of all development, which produces, not only knowledge, but, to put it in the Althusian way, the elements of political intervention. This, more than Marxism, reminds us more of utilitarianism, a legitimate child of positivism, which accepts science, this is knowledge, as a supreme good, neutral and above social development, that is, superhistorical, and seeks the way to put this knowledge into practice. Therefore, its starting point is its separation, to contribute to the social good. Of course, for the development of the theory, theoretical activity is necessary. This is evidence, and we do not believe that the MAI can be accused of underestimating the theory, but formulated like this. This is nothing more than Simplon formalism. By the way, scientism, as with nominalism, is usually very linked with formalism. Obviously, any theory needs a rational period of properly theoretical activity for its formulation, but, for Marxism, the essence of the theory, what is at its origin and links it organically with reality, is its understanding of it as a social practice, not only scientific, but at all levels, synthesized. In addition to being generous, dangerously bordering on theorism, as happened to Althusser, the comrades introduce us into a problem far from Marxism. If we are rigorous, as the theoretical debate demands, etymologically the origin of the word science is in the Latin scientia, which means knowledge. Likewise, beyond etymology, modern science, as a historically configured fact, exists for, and is its imperative, the knowledge of the world, for the rationalization and abstraction of the laws that govern it by a contemplative external subject, laws that are completely independent of that subject. Therefore, the comrades, by influencing in that way the scientific dimension of Marxism, to the point of making their fate dependent on that aspect, are subordinating their development to their ability to know the world, leaving in a second place what the true rupture of Marxism supposes with respect to all the previous forms of consciousness, which is the imperative of its transformation. In this way, we see the second characteristic of that positivist reduction of Marxism appear, the predominance of the problems of knowledge over the issues related to the transformation, with the revolution, that is, the epistemologization of Marxism. It is necessary to stop for a moment to contextualize and make intelligible our criticism of Marxist scientism and, in general, of any claim to reduce Marxism to science, to avoid misunderstandings and unilateral understandings of it that can make it derail towards subjectivism. As historical materialism teaches us, science, like the rest of human constructions, is a determined social and historical product. Modern science, that is, the one that arises and develops from the 17th century by the hand of the outstanding bourgeois revolution, remember that this century is precisely the golden age of the first modern bourgeois power, the United Provinces, and it is also the century of the English Revolution, is the most finished and sophisticated product of articulating the knowledge that society has produced classes. A general characteristic of the way of structuring knowledge by this type of society is the separation of consciousness, of the subject, with respect to reality, of the object, and intellectual reflection of the social division of labor, which, as we know, is the basic germ of class fracture. This separation is the first basic and primordial characteristic of science, which postulates that reality is an independent objective entity, whose laws are, by these same characteristics, knowable by the subject, who, for the same reason, occupies an external position of observer. This, of course, does not mean that science is assimilable to other past forms of consciousness, which are governed by these same parameters of separation, such as religion. Marxism is not a relativism, but it understands the progressive development of matter, from the lower to the higher, something, for example, that cannot account for that random materialism that led Althusser to his scientism. Science, which enthrones materialism against religious mysticism, allows us to begin to understand the world. That is why, for example, Marx said that nominalism is a first form of materialism because it discarded as a starting point of knowledge entelechies like God and invited us to know reality from reality itself. In this way, although science, as a positive knowledge, as knowledge in general, exists since the dawn of human society only from a certain degree of social development, whose premise is a considerable development of the productive forces, it appears as we know it today, as a rational materialistic system with a specific methodology and instrumental. Precisely, it is the form that best allows man's domination over nature, his conquest, which is precisely what capitalism has brought to the historical development of humanity, being the material premise of communism. However, for that very reason, science as it is configured is a purely bourgeois product. It is the product of a class society, the latest and most developed, and includes its articulation as an element of the bourgeois conception of the world, its character as a reproducer of the society that has enlarged it and that has helped to shape it. This primordial element, the basic premise of science, is what it has in common with the previous false forms of consciousness. Although it implies a qualitative change with respect to them, and it is precisely the separation of consciousness with respect to matter, including with it a whole anthropology that designates man in a particular relationship with the world, which is precisely his alienation from it, that of observer of his objective and immutable laws. It should be noted that this vision of the emergence of knowledge, neutral and desideologized, from the particular analysis of the concrete singularity, is nothing more than an ideological product, in the worst sense of the word, consubstantial to science, which materializes with the scientific ideology par excellence, positivism, son of empiricism, and that our comrades seem to share. For the UCCP, as we are seeing, theoretical practice is research and knowledge of concrete reality that must be primarily Spanish social formation, which allows producing the concept of social reality, which is, in turn, what enables the development of that science called Marxism. As we can see, we have the conventional scientific scheme, the elevation from the particular, that neutral data, usually transplanted into Marxism. However, Marx himself, speaking precisely of his method, when referring to the understanding of the supposed human nature, had already warned us that particularization is only possible as an abstraction of the multiple general determinations in which everything singular is subsumed. That is, the general is the premise of the particular. 36. But focusing more on the particular object of our criticism, even the most lucid bourgeois epistemologists have understood that all scientific research, precisely because it is carried out by real and concrete men, is preceded by a certain conception of the world, that is, that before the data was the worldview, which integrates and articulates that data in a particular way. Scientific research only begins before a scientific community believes it has found firm answers to questions such as, what are the fundamental entities of which the universe is made up? How do those entities interact with the other and with the senses? What questions can legitimately be asked about these entities and what techniques can be used to find the solutions? At least in mature sciences, the answers, or complete substitutes for them, to questions like those are firmly wed in the educational initiation that prepares and licenses students for professional practice. Because this education is both rigorous and rigid, those responses can exert a profound influence on the scientific mentality. The fact that they can do so largely justifies both the peculiar efficiency of the normal research activity and that of the direction that it follows at any given time. What Kuhn is telling us is something evident for any Marxist, although he, as a good liberal, does not formulate it like that every society generates a conception of the particular world, which serves for its reproduction, and in which he articulates the knowledge it produces, which is inseparable from that same worldview. The image of the researcher only before the truth is nothing more than a bourgeois entelechy, which is precisely the one that produces, the one that has of itself, that particular social group that is the scientific community, the specialists of knowledge in bourgeois society. However, it is true that, traditionally, Marxism has maintained an ambiguous relationship with science, going from the absolutization of its results to the denigration of bourgeois science and the search for a proletarian science. In reality, those oscillations have remained fixed in the same coordinates and are an indication of that pendulum between objectivism and subjectivism that we indicated above. Of course, as we will point out later, there is no proletarian science, nor can Marxism do without science, even if it is not reduced to it. Briefly, we will say that Marxism, as with all forms of consciousness, is also a determined historical and social product. As the comrades of the UCCP indicate very correctly, it is not possible to think of it as a finished product. Marxism, as it appears formulated in the second half of the 19th century, contains two aspects. On the one hand, Marx and Engels cemented the principles of the proletarian conception of the world, laying their foundations, but on the other, that Marxism, we insist, a determined historical and social product, expresses the crystallization of a certain specific correlation of class forces. Marxism is born at the moment when the bourgeois revolution is extinguished. Remember, 1848, the year of the Manifesto and the last classic weight of the bourgeois revolution in Europe. Historically, Marxism is illuminated as an ideological expression of a class, the proletariat, still in diapers, which is barely becoming aware of its particularity and what separates it from those who once lived with it in the third state, the bourgeoisie, and is born at a time when the conquests of the bourgeois revolution are being completed, with a still strong feudal absolutist reaction. The historical conjuncture of the moment determined that the nascent proletariat adopted an alliance with a bourgeoisie that had not yet been completely exhausted its revolutionary evers. Precisely, it will be the threat of the growing proletariat that will be deterred from continuing with its revolutionary veils in the face of that feudal reaction. The intellectual expression of this alliance, historically necessary, was the closure of ranks around materialism in general, in the face of the forms of idealism, religious or not, that propagated the reaction. This had the positive aspect of expanding and consolidating the materialistic basis of the new conception of the world that was making its way, but at the cost of sacrificing the development of what was in particular, of what separated it from the conception of the world of its next bourgeois antagonist, despite the fact that, in its general lines, it was already formulated, thesis on Feuerbach. That is the reason, necessary for the very development of the historical process, of the dialectical deficit of Marxism that codified the Second International and that is at the base of the October Revolutionary cycle, despite the many reservations that Marx always showed in life about how his disciples applied his teachings. Here is the historical basis that allows the naive enthronement of science by Marxism to be explained as an absolute and neutral good. It was a wrist tap of the enlightened revolutionary impetus of the bourgeoisie, whose witness took up a proletariat that did not yet have the practical experience necessary to deploy in all its breadth what it has of particular and independent. And it is that in the same way that dialectical materialism was born from previous materialism, the proletarian revolution is born from the bourgeois revolution, taking attached at first, we insist. It is not a failed and blurred pure proletarian essence, pre-existing to its class struggle, but the necessary process of birth of the new from the old, which any materialist can understand, many of its ideas, from which the proletariat is detachment as it unfolds its practice of particular class, which is precisely what is configuring it as an independent subject. Thus, we have two fundamental elements to understand the Marxist criticism of scientism. On the one hand, the location of science as a peculiar form of consciousness, product of the latest and most developed class society, but which shares with other intellectual forms of this type of society that alienation of consciousness with respect to matter, concretized in the external gnoseological position of the contemplative subject. And, on the other, the historical soil, that interwestment of the end of the bourgeois revolution with the beginning of the proletarian revolution, which allows us to understand the material basis, based on the class struggle and the relationship of the classes themselves, of the complex link between Marxism and science throughout the October cycle, which justified the appearance of that Marxist positivism, which in reality was nothing more than the expression of the immaturity of a class that had just appeared on the stage of history. With these elements we remain firmly anchored in the field of historical materialism, and we comply with that maxim required of us by the balance of the October cycle, which is that of the application of Marxism to the historically existing Marxism itself. With these elements, it is necessary to give a few more brushstrokes to understand what Marxism is original compared to other previous forms of consciousness. We have pointed out, and it is a classic Marxist thesis, that capitalism, with the immense development of the productive forces that brings with the conquest and domination of nature by the human being, lays the material foundations of communism. We had already said that this is precisely where it is possible to place science as a particular and historically determined form of consciousness. Science is the intellectual emblem of this conquest, of undoubted progressive scope for the development of humanity. However, from this moment on, we culminate the entry into another stage of the matter, the social stadium. Actually, from the point of view of Marxism, the class society represents this bridge, the passage of humanity from its primitive biological stage to the social stage. The era of the domination of capital, that materialized contradiction that Marx said, represents the contradictory culmination of this transition, the last manifestation of this period of interregnum, the last class society, and the material basis necessary for social matter to fully re-encounter itself, communism. In this sense, Marx pointed out that, in all the ways in which land ownership dominates, the relationship with nature is still predominant. On the other hand, in those where capital reigns, the socially, historically, created element predominates. And precisely, as we pointed out, science, the product of a time when the bourgeoisie was still an ascending and progressive class, arises in a historical moment, 17th century, when the bourgeoisie is preparing to conquer the world and offer the dominion of nature by man on the altar of historical development. That is why science, as it is historically configured, that is, around a positivist ethos, contemplative subject of external objective laws, hypothetical deductive method, etc., makes sense. Because it is precisely the knowledge of a stage of matter, the physical and natural world, pre-existing to humanity, in whose configuration this, the subjective element, has not played any role. However, from the enthronization of capital, when its domination extends throughout the planet, and even begins to transcend it, it is the social element, as Marx points out, that plays the main aspect, to the extreme of subsuming, denying and including, denial of denial, the previous natural basis, since even, to the dismay of the naive ecologist, nature itself begins to appear more and more as a historically determined, productive and social relationship. However, here there is no longer room for the parameters of the previous contemplative vulgar materialism, in whose confines the really configured science is enclosed, precisely because here the subjective aspect is intertwined with the objective, forming an indissoluble whole in mutual determination. And let's remember, once again, as Marx in his first thesis on Feuerbach reproached the previous materialism for not understanding the subjective aspect of materiality, of objectivity itself. And precisely the fundamental attribute of the social form of matter is consciousness, which is what substantiates subjectivity. It is no coincidence that it is just at this moment when dialectical materialism arises and the foundations of a new conception of the world begin to be laid, which is very new and, at the same time, continuation of the progressive development of humanity, which includes science, but is not reduced to it, again, that figure so hated by Althusser, the denial of denial. However, our comrades of the UCCP, collecting that positivist tradition of Marxism, the basis for whose rational understanding we have outlined in the previous pages, seem to refuse to understand what is original and superior in said Marxism as a new form of social consciousness. Thus, the comrades show themselves to be debtors of this tradition of transferring the conceptions of positive sciences to society, not understanding, or at least behaving, as that Marxism is not subject to the development of the dialectical evolution of the world, where its adaptation to social reality is necessary and essential through the process of intellectual development proven with social practice, is the most direct way to fall into the schematism and subjectivism that governs the bourgeois conception of the world. Here the comrades blatantly show us this trend. Marxism must adapt to social reality, whose laws are objective and pre-existing, with practice being, consequently, the equivalent of the experiment in the natural sciences, which serves that contemplative subject to verify to what extent his hypothesis, product of his intellectual development, is combined with the real functioning of the world. The UCCP takes this conception to its ultimate consequences, assimilating, in an exercise of epistemological reductionism, the laws of society with those of nature. The abolition of capitalist private property through the expropriation of the means of production in the hands of individual capitalists and the state. This means that the necessary material conditions must be created for the progressive development of the productive forces, basis for the consolidation of the new society, without the obstacles of private appropriation, of the full development of production according to a collective and conscious planning, in accordance with the laws that govern nature. 42. Of course, there is no danger of subjectivism here. Yes, on the other hand, we see his twin brother, objectivism, appear. The legitimate children of this positivist philosophical conception are in politics, as we see, the theory of productive forces, and, his sister when enthusiasm still reigns, the thesis of the inevitability of socialism. The comrades of the UCCP seem to assign this function of productive development to socialism, but this is precisely what capitalism gives us, an immense growth of material productive capacity. That is why it is the premise of communism. These elements in the ideology of our comrades are, without a doubt, the result of the influence of a cycle in which organizations mechanically adhered to the revolutionary process by ideological identification and political concordance to the historical context. 43. This type of imperative made sense in revolutionary Russia due to the relatively poor capitalist development of the Tsarist Empire, but it has no reason to be in a developed imperialist society such as the Spanish state. What it is about here is that the revolutionary subject, from the conquest of power, dictatorship of the proletariat, which is the true content of socialism, transforms the objective laws that have so far governed the development of the productive forces, which are those of the accumulation of capital, and ensures its continuity from new bases, which safeguard humanity from the abyss where the objective development of capitalist laws has placed it. And this is no subjectivism, it is the dialectic that the course of the material progress of humanity allows now, in the era of imperialism and the proletarian revolution, for the first time in history. This conception, as demonstrated by the experience of the October cycle, and it is to some extent logical that these positivist notions, which already came from the Second International, were reaffirmed in the Soviet Union, with what this meant of influence on the newborn MCI, having the Soviet state as one of its first and main tasks that productive development, via state capitalism, of which we speak, leads to the starvation of the subject, to make it a mere endorser of objective social development, preventing us from understanding the role that the category of revolution plays, not as a simple sanction of the laws of the objective social process as they have been given so far, but as an agent of the transformation of those same laws. That and nothing else is the proletarian revolution. Actually, the category that definitely distinguishes the Marxist theory of knowledge from any previous epistemology is the revolutionary praxis, the dialectical unit of theory and practice in mutual transformation. Surely, where this principle has been best and most clearly enunciated in the Marxian work is in the third thesis on Feuerbach, the materialistic theory that men are a product of circumstances and education, and that, therefore, modified men are the product of different circumstances and a different education, forgets that circumstances are made to be changed precisely by men and that the educator himself needs to be educated. It leads, therefore, necessarily, to the division of society into two parts, one of which is above society, thus, for e.g., Roberto Owen. The coincidence of the modification of circumstances and human activity can only be conceived and understood rationally as a revolutionary practice. Here we see how Marx masterfully starting from the criticism of the vulgar materialist position, a formation of the subjective aspect, men, as a mere reflection of objectivity, the circumstances, and showing us society as an organic whole, without the possibility that there is anything above it, comes to revolutionary practice as an element that solves the enigma about who educates the educator. Thus, in a few lines we have passed, interrelated it organically, from the question of education, knowledge, to that of the revolution as an integral aspect of that same knowledge. And it is that, really, Marxism represents an ontic-epistemological unit, where being and knowledge are one and the same thing, that is, the revolution. Precisely, when dealing with the question of society from Marxism, the gnoseological position that is the starting point of science, that of the contemplative external subject, it appears to us as a mixtification, precisely because there is no part of society that is above itself that serves as a privileged watchtower from which to scrutinize its functioning. In fact, the way par excellence of conceiving that subject who observes social matter from the outside is the figure of God. Therefore, attempts to oppose scientific vulgar materialism to dialectical materialism ineluctably derail towards idealism, and science, as it is configured today, in the era of decadent capitalism, appears to us as a focus of propagation of all kinds of relativistic, agnostic and skeptical philosophies and anthropologies, and that is why the attempts to solve the crisis of Marxism from positivist scientist positions, as represented by the figure of Althusser and his disciples, ended. Disillusionment through, in the acceleration of its decomposition and in an unbridled race towards subjectivism. Thus, dialectical materialism conceives the subject, not simply as such, but as an objectified subject, determined by social and historical circumstances, but, in turn, understands the object as a subjectivated object, since the circumstances themselves are constructed and altered by those determined subjects. Precisely, it is those elements that we have highlighted, of which we are informed by dialectical and historical materialism, of the passage of matter in its natural form to its social stage and of the role of capitalism in this period of transition that shape the absolutely original physiognomy of the proletariat, incomparable with other oppressed classes in history, and the determining weight that for its revolutionary enterprise plays the role of consciousness, which, on the other hand, is closely related to the nature of the future communist society. There are no objective laws that ensure the natural transition from capitalism to communism. We believe that the best demonstration of this assert has been the mournful end of the October revolutionary cycle and the state in which it has left the MCI. The contradiction between the growing socialization of the productive forces and the private appropriation of their products generates, it is true, the tendency to socialism, but also the countertrend to capitalist restructuring through the monopoly. What trend wins depends on the class struggle and the position that the revolutionary proletarian line manages to occupy, that is, it depends on the conscious subjective factor, hence the core importance of the Communist Party. In short, it is because of the very materiality and social interiority of this subject, the revolutionary proletariat, that there are no revolutionary laws pre-existing to the same revolution, but that these laws are created only as the subject acts, determining, transforming each other with their circumstances. Indeed, these laws only exist from the revolutionary class struggle of the proletariat. The change of position of the subject alters the entire objective starting frame, already unrecoverable, and places us in a new stage, which is, by the way, the reason why, coherently with dialectical materialism, the revolutionary process, the development of the RPM, has a cyclical and nonlinear form. This is how the organic, internal link between knowledge and revolution is understood, since the first law of the revolutionary work is the conscious activity of the subject, who learns to know the work in which he is embarked as he executes it. Thus we can begin to glimpse the fundamental importance of the balance of the historical practical experience of the RPM, since it represents the period of rational accomplishment between our knowledge and the degree of development achieved by the revolutionary work of the proletariat. About the balance of the October cycle, as we say, the balance of the October cycle represents the harmonization of our knowledge as a proletarian avant-garde with the degree achieved real and historically by the revolutionary class struggle of the proletariat. And it represents the fulfillment of one of the two factors that make Marxism operational as an avant-garde theory, which is the synthesis of all the previous experience of the class struggle. This, as we have pointed out on numerous occasions, is not something that the MAI in particular, or the Reconstitution line in general, have taken out of the sleeve, but is inscribed with gold letters in the best of the revolutionary tradition of communism. Marxism is developed through these periodic balance sheets, which represent that theoretical synthesis of a previous revolutionary practice. This leaves the theory in a position to integrate into social practice and revolutionize it to guide it, as a revolutionary praxis, to a higher stage. We have said it many times, Marx and Engels made this balance of the revolutionary experience of 1848 and the Paris Commune, Lenin from the period from 1871 to 1917, Stalin from the first years of the construction of socialism in the USSR, and Mao from the experience of the Soviet Union. All this made it possible to place the theory at the height of the revolutionary demands of the moment and to encourage the revolutionary work to advance a step. Without the Paris Commune, Marx would not have formulated the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat, not only as a transformation of the proletariat into the ruling class, but also as a demolition of the bureaucratic military apparatus of the bourgeoisie. Similarly, without the experience of socialism in the USSR and the way in which it led to the restoration of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie by the hand of the revisionists, Mao and the Chinese communists would not have formulated and implemented the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, which tells the present and future revolutionary proletarians how to continue the process of the revolution within the revolution and avoid its stagnation and the consequent capitalist restoration. By the way, the problem introduced to us by the Chinese experience, the derevolutionization of the revolution, already indicates that the positivist mold of knowing and respecting the laws of history is not enough for the proletariat, but that it is necessary to start from a higher point of view, the ability of the revolutionary subject to transform those laws. What is perhaps more innovative is the explicit conceptualization that the Reconstitution line carries out of the need for this task, and the demand, in line with the unprecedented crisis in which the MCI has already been immersed for a long time without giving clear signals that point to its overcoming, that the new balance includes the previous ones. The reason for this must be sought in what we pointed out of primitive Marxism, not only as the foundation of the proletarian worldview, but also as a theoretical expression of a certain historical correlation of class forces. This correlation was expressed in a certain discourse as what we call the revolutionary paradigm of October. A paradigm is a necessary a prioristic way of understanding the revolution, its mechanisms, its instruments and its stages, and, as we have pointed out, this paradigm is formed during the second half of the 19th century and responds to two unrepeatable historical facts, which serve as a historical starting point for the proletarian revolution. The intertwining of the end of the bourgeois revolution with the beginning of the RPM and the era of formation of the proletariat as a class in itself, as an economic class with differentiated and particular interests within the same capitalist society. This unique conjuncture gave rise to a revolutionary archetype that emphasized the spontaneous development of the revolution from the impulse of the economic struggles of the proletariat, that is, a way of understanding the spontaneous insurrectionalist revolution. To a certain extent, this responded to the expectations of the moment and had a tour. However, as the RPM develops, this paradigm is gradually entering into crisis, and this is due, precisely, to the very success of the RPM, which completely upsets that starting point. On the one hand, it is no longer possible to count on the insurrectional impulse coming from a sector of the bourgeoisie, 1848, or the memory of its deeds, 1871. Capitalism, today, is firmly established in the globe and, therefore, any progressive function that would remain to play the bourgeoisie has expired, imperialism. In addition, the bourgeoisie itself has made an act of contrition and has taken advantage of the collapse of real socialism to settle accounts with its own revolutionary past, openly denying it and criminalizing it. We can remember the reactionary orgy, an authentic phenomenon that expressed the intellectual environment of the moment, which was in the field of historiography the commemoration of the second centenary of the French Revolution, coinciding with the fall of the wall. On the other hand, the very development of capitalism and the RPM has generated a whole déclassade and Arabista fraction of the working class, the working aristocracy, which feeds precisely on economic struggles, and which is the most effective counter-revolutionary firewall that the bourgeoisie has ever had. 47. All this, along with the long crisis of the MCI, has created the conditions, if the proletarian avant-garde is up to the situation, for the formulation of a new paradigm at the level of the circumstances in which the development of the RPM has placed us, opening the perspective of a new, and more qualitatively elevated, revolutionary assault, of a new cycle of the RPM. It is for all this reason that the gnoseological scheme of positivism, that of the uninterrupted accumulation of knowledge from an immovable basis, is not operational, because the very development of the revolution calls into question its bases, being themselves the theoretical expression of a certain historical conjuncture, forced to revolutionize itself. A revolutionary ontology that started from the assumption of the existence of a static base would only be a comic fraud. Of course, there is only one doctrine capable of coherently assimilating all these demands, and it is the one that gives rise to the concept of revolutionary praxis, Marxism. For all these reasons, the balance plays a fundamental role for the future of the development of the MCI and the RPM, because it is not only about knowing a reality external to us, with laws that are always equal to themselves, but it is about knowing the transformations that the revolution has operated, both in the subject itself and in the object, because we have already seen that from dialectical materialism these elements are, strictly, inseparable. If the balance had to be reduced to a fundamental aspect, we would say that, precisely, it is the theoretical operation of the vanguard that deals with the state of the subject, where it comes from and where it goes. What instruments have expired and which it has discovered to replace them, what is the new relationship between these instruments and also between their categories, etc., for which it is essential to know the intrinsic relationship of that subject with the environment in which it develops, that is, the study of revolutionary social transformations. Precisely, these are the reasons why from the point of view of a dualistic and objectivist ontology, such as that of Marxist positivism, today dominant in the MCI, it is so difficult to understand both the thesis of the cycle and the need for balance, because it does not understand the substantiveness of the subject, its materiality and objectivity, which is as much as saying that he does not understand dialectical materialism, but only conceives it as a reflection of an objective, immutable, and external process. And we are very afraid that, despite their recognition of the need for a new revolutionary stage, the comrades of the UCCP, due to their affiliation to that Marxist scientism, despite their goodwill, have not finished, although they formally accept it, understanding the deep meaning of the balance and its precise location in a specific point of the Reconstitution plan. In this way, the UCCP, whenever it refers to the need for this task, is to place it next to its famous cause, which, we already know, is that theoretical practice through analysis of Spanish social formation. Agreeing that it is necessary to take stock of the October cycle, we believe that it is as much as the above to incorporate the analysis of Spanish social formation into the research task. Although the recognition of the need for the balance is undoubtedly a positive aspect, which we value from the MAI, we believe that it is no coincidence that practically whenever it appears in the documents of the comrades it is to be placed next to the task of that concrete analysis, whose key function in the UCCP scheme we have already pointed out. This minimization, in the sense of loss of substantivity as a specific task of the balance sheet, is confirmed as we delve into the documents of this communist organization. With regard to this, we believe that it is necessary not only to study the processes of formation of the communist parties of the socialist countries, but also the specific conditions of the current situation, that is, the analysis of Spanish social formation, the objective and political conditions of the proletarian revolution. Without it, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to elaborate the conditions for the formation of the Communist Party today in the Spanish state. It is neither materialistic nor dialectical. In this way, as we can appreciate, the integral balance of the first historical cycle of the RPM, essential, as we have been pointing out, to theoretically rise to the understanding of the whole of historical movement and have a clear vision of the conditions, the march and the general results of the proletarian movement, as Marx and Engels demanded of the communists and components of the proletarian vanguard. It is already reduced to knowing simply the processes of formation of the communist parties of the socialist countries. We could talk about the implications of this vision of taking into account only the apparently successful and correct results, as it seems to underlie in the assert of studying only the formation of the parties that came to power, which would simply confirm the affiliation of the comrades to positivism, which does not understand error as an intrinsic part of the process of knowledge, but only as a limitation of it, being able to overlook those processes that presumably, due to their premature failure, did not adjust to those supposed laws prefixed of revolutionary development. But in addition, this type of requirements leaves aside the study of the experiences of the proletariat in power, amputating one of the fundamental requirements to be able to reconstitute the avant-garde theory and elaborate a program at the height of the practical revolutionary experience of our class, which is the study of the maximum degree of development achieved by the RPM. As if that were not enough, it also ignores the knowledge of the processes carried out by parties that did not fully conquer power, but that have undoubtedly contributed a baggage of precious revolutionary experiences, essential for the rearmament of our class, as is the case of the Communist Party of Peru and the Peruvian Revolution, or, more generally, the processes of people's war led by the Maoists in recent decades. This progressive emptying of the content of a primary task for the reconstitution of communism has just been completed when the comrades define the content of the proletarian political line. By political line, we understand the set of principles by which revolutionary activity must be governed according to its purpose, the knowledge in broad outline of the historical experience of the struggle of the proletariat to achieve its social liberation, the concrete knowledge of the concrete reality in which the class struggle is developed, and the general and particular tactics in its class confrontation against the bourgeoisie. Thus, we see that the UCCP feels the need to adjective with that in broad strokes the degree of knowledge that the avant-garde must have regarding the historical experience of the RPM. It is not, of course, erudition the objective of the balance, but we believe we have explained enough, and not only in this work, the intrinsic need for it. If revolutionary theory is the foundation of the revolutionary movement, and if this theory is nothing more than synthesized practice, it is clear that this task cannot be simply reduced to a superficial knowledge of the revolutionary tradition, which seems to operate more as a capricious additive for the folkloric celebration of militancy than as a substantial element of revolutionary rearmament. In addition, there is no sign of an organic link between this knowledge in broad strokes of revolutionary history and the knowledge of the concrete reality in the conformation of the political line. In fact, it is more like that metaphysical and eclectic two make one than, as it really is, the embodiment of the proletarian worldview in a certain specific situation, as a growing concretion of the revolutionary theory until it crystallizes, mediated by the political line, in program. But we will talk about this a little more closely when we discuss the process of the reconstitution of the Communist Party. We believe, as we have been pointing out in all this work, that this reduction of the substantive of the balance and what it represents in the current circumstances that the MCI is going through is not accidental and responds to deep divergences in the underlying understanding of Marxism. It does not hurt to remember again the ardent hostility that Althusser showed for historicism throughout his work, historicism without which, as we have suggested, and beyond the possible excesses of his representatives throughout the cycle, excesses that had to do with the ignorance of the role of the Communist Party, dialectic is incomprehensible. For the rest, the comrades of the UCCP themselves point out in this sense when they express, in a way that our understanding is confused, the reasons for this attitude of theirs towards the balance. We understand the crisis of Marxist theory as the crisis of the different Marxisms, that is, the application of Marxism as a scientific theory to a certain historical situation that is not, in any case, extrapolable by the law of the particularity of dialectics. This does not mean that Marxism, as a science, is not universal, but that as a universal theory it has to be applied in its particularity, that is, in each specific historical situation. Knowledge of the particular contradictions of each historical phase of the general process, as happened with Leninism, development of Marxism appropriate to the particular characteristics of imperialism. To begin with, it is not at all clear, if Leninism is the knowledge of the particular contradictions of a historical phase, imperialism, how can there be a plurality of Marxisms that enter into crisis in that same imperialist phase? Well, As far as we know, we are still in it. Another thing, which seems more plausible seeing the place that theoretical practice occupies in the conceptions of comrades and the crucial importance they attach to the analysis of Spanish social formation, is that the UCCP understands the true development of Marxism as the particular analysis of each society understood as national or state individuality. In fact, this reminds us a lot of that nominalism, taken up by Althusser, for which everything real is always singular, consequently, the same thing happening with Marxism. There would be no crises of Marxism but a crisis of its particular applications. The readers of El Martinite will be able to judge how much this explanation is similar to what is usual among Maoists to justify the defeats of the revolutions they led in recent decades, and it is normal, since both share the same positivist matrix. In reality, what dialectics points out is not that the particularity is not extrapolable, that reality functions as a series of particular watertight compartments adhest to each other, but that, precisely, the universal is manifested through the particular, which form an interpenetrated dialectical unit. Mao, for example, pointed it out clearly: the particular and the universal are united, and not only the particularity but also the universality of the contradiction are inherent in everything. Universality resides in the particularity. In fact, without generalization or abstraction, without extrapolation, there would be no type of science. And, this being an essential requirement for the understanding of the general development of matter, it is particularly true in the field of society in that imperialist era that they point out, which is that of the world interturtling of capital and that of its accumulation on a planetary scale, that of the universalization of its mechanisms, which, not by chance, is the era of the proletarian revolution. If we add to this the fact that, as we have pointed out, the laws of the revolution do not pre-exist itself, but are created with it, we finish understanding the need to study in depth the process of the RPM, because if what we want is not simply to know, but to transform, if the requirement of knowledge is a requirement for the revolution, we must know it if we want to develop it. And, as we say, there is no other field for this than that of the practical historical experience of the first cycle of the RPM, and all its complexity and multiple facets. In fact, as we will see, that is precisely the premise to be able to address the analysis of our immediate reality, which, of course, we do not deny and is fundamental, with guarantees of transforming it. But it is that the understanding expressed by our comrades goes against the very empirical manifestation of the RPM and has very dangerous ideological and political consequences. Marxism is not formed as a sum of particular applications, but the revolutionary political discourse that the MCI insurges and is formulated, commented through, from the experience of the Russian Revolution. It is the Bolsheviks, the vanguard of the RPM, who imposed the conditions of entry into the Communist International, IC, from their practical experience in the detachment with opportunism, and it is in their literature and their example in which generations of communist militants are formed around the world. This, the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat in Russia, is a condition, since it generates a new correlation of forces in the world and promotes with its example the formation of the MCI, for the subsequent development of the RPM during the cycle. In fact, to speak of the other great revolution of the 20th century, Mao and the Communist Party of China are not only formed from the empirical and non-extrapolationable analysis of the Chinese social formation, but for their constitution, as the Chinese communists themselves recognized, the mediation of a universal phenomenon, the October Revolution, and the consequent irradiation of a certain type of historically constituted Marxism is fundamental. Similarly, previously, it is the practical achievements of another particular detachment of the international proletariat, the German, that promote and inspire the formation of the international socialist movement and the formulation of its doctrine, which greatly influences the formation of Lenin and the Bolsheviks. These are concrete examples precisely of that interpenetration of the universal and the particular, of how the development of the particular needs the mediation of the universal, and, in turn, the development of the particular is at the basis of the universal. But it is also that, continuing with the example, at the basis of that socialist movement was, among other things, because it was not in purity the doctrine of Marx the only one that participated and influenced the formation of the first great labor movement, but it is not the work of this work to extend on this point the synthesis that Marx makes of all the experience of the class struggle and previous social development. Note, comrades, that here not only particular moments are extrapolated within a certain mode of historical production, but even between different historical formations. Without this effort of extrapolation, of generalization and abstraction, there would be, as we say, not only science in general, but also historical or dialectical materialism. Why do we have to refuse to do something similar with the first RPM cycle to put revolutionary theory at the height demanded by current historical circumstances? And it is precisely, we repeat, what the dialectic tells us and confirms the development of the RPM is that the particularity is only understandable, it only makes sense, from universality, and vice versa. To understand this it is necessary the thorough study of the particular, but it is not, in this case, the Reconstitution line or the MAI that postulate that it is enough to know the history of the RPM in broad strokes. If we take this logic of non-extrapolation to its ultimate consequences, we question the historically demonstrated form of development of the MCI, which is formed from the highest, from the most advanced particular experience, which is precisely the vanguard of the construction of a new universal society. The example of October that we have pointed out is resounding in this sense. With this type of particularist ideas, we can come to question proletarian internationalism, whose starting point is to consider the planet as a universal battlefield between the international proletariat and imperialism, a conception that is the basis of formation from, as we point out, the most advanced of the IC. But in addition, in relation to all this, this logic has a direct connection with the revisionist theory of the national paths to socialism propagated by the Soviet social imperialists. Of course, we do not say that the comrades of the UCCP support this type of thesis, we simply point out certain logical consequences that could occur coherently if we develop their argumentation. We understand that comrades insist on these points to combat the dogmatic erroneous tendency, and very common during the cycle, to mechanically transplant the experiences of triumphant revolutions to any reality without mediating any type of concrete analysis. But the root of this problem is in the poor knowledge of Marxism and in the limited implementation of the two-line struggle in the formation of the communist detachments that followed in the wake of the various milestones of the RPM. And not in the existence of universal, extrapolable teachings, which are key and fundamental for everything we have been pointing out, in these milestones. We believe that comrades, in their eagerness to combat a mistake, threaten to fall, pushed by that scientific conception, into the opposite, and perhaps more nefarious, error of empiricism. This scientific path through which our comrades have been interned, and which we are striving to delimit from scientism, leads to the destiny of reducing Marxism to a methodology of knowledge, as that famous theoretical practice seems to be. We conceive of Marxism as the scientific theory that allows us to produce, through study and social practice, the concept of capitalist production, the knowledge of society governed by capitalist relations of production and their transformation through the class struggle. As a science, it consists of a theoretical body, fundamental principles and concepts, and a theoretical activity, which acts with a specific methodology in order to transform social reality. In fact, this seems to us the most coherent way, in view of what we have been unraveling, of understanding the denial of a general crisis of Marxism, accepting only that of its particular applications. Indeed, the crisis of Marxist science would come from the insufficiency of its ability to know the particularities of the respective social formations. It would be the inability of the different Marxisms, or perhaps of particular Marxists, with which we dangerously border on subjective idealism, to produce the concept of its immediate reality, but Marxism itself would remain immaculate as a methodology in some Platonic world, always ready to be substantiated as soon as some group of social scientists coherently uses its tools, its specific methodology. If any theory reminds us of this, it is, more than Marxism, Kantian critical philosophy. Here, the methodology would fulfill the role of that transcendental, unconditional, and indeterminate subject, not affected or only externally by the practical vicissitudes, which would only be substantiated, would be filled with content from the knowledge of the outside world, even if he himself was prior to that knowledge that has a fundamentally empirical root, that particular and non-extrapolatable social formation, which, by the way, reminds us of that unique and singular conjuncture of the last Althusser. In any case, even the same scientific epistemology has called into question the primacy of the methodological totem as a panacea of science. What aspect of science will be the most prominent during this effort? The first, at least in order of presentation, is that of the inadequacies of the methodological guidelines to dictate, by themselves, a unique substantive conclusion to many types of scientific questions. This is closely related to the previous quote from this author that we have brought, which pointed out the existence as a necessary premise in all scientific research the existence of a previous conception of the world, in which it articulates both the methods and the results of that research. And that is the key issue. Indeed, Marxism is a totalizing worldview of the universe, whose premise is the intrinsic linkage of knowledge and the transformation of the world, that is, a revolutionary conception of the world. What is at the origin of the crisis of Marxism is not its inability to know the world, but the degree of impotence, due to the wear and tear suffered during the development of the revolutionary cycle, to which it has been reduced to transform it. Produce the concept or produce the subject? On the reconstitution of the Communist Party so far we have tried to express the rudiments of a criticism from historical and dialectical materialism to the foundations of Marxist scientism, fundamentally of its misunderstanding of the subjective aspect of material practice. Subsequently, we have tried to show the necessary link between this scientism and the minimization of historical problems, of the incomprehension of the weight of the drift of history in the conformation of our current situation, prioritizing, on the other hand, the conjunctural and immediate analysis over the task of the balance. Now, we will try to show the consequences of these conceptions in the face of the main task facing the proletariat of this country, the reconstitution of the Communist Party. In this way, we will compare the sketch that the comrades of the UCCP offer us of their vision on how this process has to take place and what its character is with the plan defended by the Reconstitution line, all trying to stick to the context of what has been developed so far. As we have seen, the premise of science is that separation of consciousness from matter. This conception, which is at the base of all scientificism, also ends up crowning the explanation of the crisis of Marxism by our comrades, translating in the separation of theory from practice. This is reflected in the UCCP documents. The crisis of Marxism has a double significance: the non-existence of Marxist theoretical practice and the non-existence of revolutionary political practice. As we have been pointing out, there is no place for this dichotomy, for this dualization, since, strictly, from the point of view of Marxism, the task of knowing and transforming are not different issues. However, this dualization has very dangerous practical consequences from the point of view of the Reconstitution line, because by talking about double significance, it opens the door to conceiving a theoretical development that is not linked to the revolution, or, as it is in the reconstitution phase in which we are, that is not linked to the construction of the Marxist-Leninist avant-garde, with which that theoretical practice would again manifest itself as mere formalism, which serves as an internal instrument of the avant-garde, while the activity with social transcendence that it carries out is detached from the problem of the recomposition of revolutionary theory. In fact, this is precisely what happens when the UCCP establishes the necessary stages that, in its opinion, requires the reconstruction of the party. This goal needs a plan divided into at least 3 stages. We are going to focus on the first stage. This stage is that of regrouping of the Marxist forces. In the current circumstances, we must begin by regrouping the nuclei of support for the revolution, tending to cooperation and unity of action in the perspective of creating the political conditions for unification in a common project that aims at the construction of the party. The reunification must have as immediate tasks: 1. Strengthen the process of constitution of the avant-garde through the theoretical study and the ideological struggle related to the problems that the revolution has to solve, and 2. Establish political links with the most advanced elements of the exploited masses with the purpose of revolutionizing the bourgeoisie-proletarian contradiction. The second stage of elaboration of the political line, and the third organizational consolidation. The first thing to point out is the undoubtedly positive fact that the comrades conceive of the need for a plan, of that tactical plan that Lenin pointed out when facing the task of reconstituting the party, which is a specific and substantive moment in the development of the proletarian revolution, being, specifically, the task that gives content to the preparation phase of the revolution. This puts them back ahead of the majority of the communist detachments of the Spanish state, which, in reality, only conceive the work of party building as a mere quantitative growth of their particular detachment, since their participation in the development of the spontaneous struggles of the masses, seasoned, of course, with those calls to communist unity, always conceived as a compadrio of cliques with their backs to the masses, when not as a mere hypocritical masquerade of who, deep down, is already considered the true party. However, despite this positive aspect, the consequences of that dualism and that scientific and formalistic conception of Marxism that the comrades of the UCCP immediately handle are noticed in their plan. Thus, we have that the first stage is divided into two subphases, the first of theoretical development, it seems that internal, within the avant-garde, and the second of linkage with the most advanced sectors of the masses to nothing more and nothing less than revolutionize the bourgeoisie-proletarian contradiction. All this before even elaborating the political line, a task that is set for the second stage. In our opinion, this represents an antinomy, a false contradiction, which is the result of coexistence in the line of the comrades of correct elements, who attend to the real state of the class struggle in the current historical framework and the situation in which the avant-garde is in this context, and which, in this sense, converge with the reconstitution line, together with conceptions inherited from the cycle, of whose background content as well as the particular historical context that led them we are trying to account in this work. Thus, along with the former, which, beyond some nuance in relation to the criticisms we have exposed so far, we can subscribe from the MAI, we will not tire of repeating that the main task of the communists at the moment is the construction of the party. That construction will be the result of a long historical process that has to be articulated in an ideological, political, and organizational way at the same time as social life. The class struggle develops, sometimes silently and sometimes openly, although without being subject to such events, since it depends on the constitution and formation of the communist vanguard, an activity linked to the understanding of the role of Marxist theory to the class struggle, and its link with the exploited masses, where the application of said theory to concrete reality prevails. We have to point out, in terms of this issue, that we are in the phase of the formation of the avant-garde that marks its tasks, and these are located in the theoretical field, in the theoretical struggle against revisionism and opportunism, and in the elaboration of the revolutionary political line. The second ones appear. The action of the communists in their mobilizations must be aimed at denouncing their maneuvers of pact and class collaboration with the bourgeoisie and the state to divert the workers from their true interests. We must use their activities to get propaganda according to the specific case, depending on our forces. We must face these policies, without being afraid to attend their calls to denounce from the outside their character of a reactionary class, providing as an alternative a revolutionary political line. It is worth insisting on the problem that appears to us immediately and that expresses that antinomy that we are talking about. If the tasks are to build the vanguard and the elaboration of its political line, how can we pretend to simultaneously carry out that work of going to the spontaneous movement or to the mass mobilizations convened by other classes or class fractions to provide that revolutionary line alternative that, at the same time, is recognized that it is not that and that must be elaborated? In reality, all this is perfectly consistent with the conceptions of the comrades that we have been exposing so far. As there is no crisis of Marxism, but of its particular applications, and it remains immaculate and intact, as conceptual corpus and specific methodology, The communists can already pretend to carry out a fruitful activity among the great masses, since, in addition, the impact of the capitalist economic crisis is providing elements that favor a positive subjectivity towards Marxism and the proletarian revolution in opposition to social pessimism, which seems to have made the proletarians recover their class instinct. Here is what we have pointed out again about the minimization of the historical problems that the revolutionary proletariat drags with the end of the October cycle, since a change of conjuncture is enough to make the masses oscillate again towards the proletarian revolution, since, after all, the subjective is nothing more than a mere reflection of the objective socio-economic process. All this, evidently, is related to that insistence on the immediate analysis and even with the Althusserian conjuncturization of the story that we denounced above. Of course, the drastic worsening of their living conditions is forcing the social crisis and the radicalization of the masses. What we deeply disagree with is that it mechanically favors a subjectivity favorable to the proletarian revolution, basically, because for that the proletarian revolution should be a plausible political reference. That subjectivity should exist, which was precisely lost with the end of the cycle. The only possibility of recovering it is for the avant-garde to solve the tasks of ideological and political reconstitution of communism that the sad end of the revolutions of the 20th century demands of us. It should be said that our perception of the mood of the masses also differs from that of our comrades. For our part, we do not see that any social pessimism is being resolved. On the contrary, along with the growing boredom of the masses, it is not difficult to glimpse a sad hopelessness in the face of the impossibility of seeing any alternative horizon to the one designated by the financial capital guidelines. If we are really materialistic, it is necessary to observe political situations in places where the social crisis is, as in Spain, as acute as the decomposition of the revolutionary movement. Look at Greece and how, along with the spontaneous ideologies of the despair of the oppressed, such as anarchist nihilism, the blackest fascist reaction raises its head, while communism continues to be discredited by the hand of the economicist parliamentary managers of the social crisis, KKE. Look at the English August that England burned a couple of years ago, or how the French banlieues burn every weekend, and see how this does not go hand in hand with the consolidation of any revolutionary proletarian reference. Despair generates social output, but not revolution. That must be provided by the avant-garde through the resolution of the objective problems posed by the historical tasks of reconstitution. The rest, the naive hope that the conjuncture will exempt us communists from our responsibilities of independent construction of a reference, is to revitalize spontaneism precisely before the most mature vanguard sector, and we do not refer exclusively to us, which has gone further in the criticism of the outdated conceptions that feed that type of vain hope. In short, and we believe that the political situation in Europe proves us right, if we communists do not entrust ourselves to the obligations that the context of the end of cycle imposes on us, we will see the brown beast resurgence rather than the proletarian revolution. Of course, this does not mean that the communists are absent from the mass mobilizations. To believe that the reconstitution line defends that is to accept the propaganda that revisionism pours against it, its need, and the absence of Marxist arguments, to caricature it to combat it. But, due to the objective situation of the vanguard, a situation that comrades recognize when they talk about the priority task of building it and elaborating its political line, the communists cannot yet aspire to present a global alternative in these movements, a combat with mass incidents that aspires to a social fracture of the reformistry reivindicative movement, which is what one would expect from the opposition of two antagonistic configured lines. What we can propose is the detection of the individual elements belonging to the practical avant-garde, a category we will talk about below, most predisposed to understand the implications of a revolutionary policy and aspire to build the mechanisms that allow us to restituate them, raise them, so that they contribute to the resolution of the tasks required by the construction of that revolutionary alternative. In addition, a propaganda work can be carried out to fire the members of the vanguard and set elements that make the masses become familiar with the way of raising the problems of the communists, but without a proselytistic spirit at first. In this sense, the MAI, where it has organization, has participated in the main mass mobilizations of recent times, 15M, general strikes, etc., although without highlighting it especially in its publications, for the political consideration that the primary activity of conscious proletarians continues to be located elsewhere and that an excessive visualization of this secondary aspect could disfigure the correct understanding of the current tasks and needs by the most advanced members of the proletariat. We believe that the UCCP can share many of these considerations, but their understanding, largely dualist scientist, of Marxism leads them to exaggerate at times the importance of this type of secondary activity, mixing at the same stage of party construction contradictory tasks that can lead to the collapse and dispersion of the reconstitution line, pulling down the most advanced sectors of the avant-garde, which are the protagonists of the present moment, immersing them again in the old revisionist economicist work style, which for too long has dominated our movement and is, in large part, the person responsible for the current situation of impotence of communism. As we say, these problems are the result of fundamental divergences in the understanding of Marxism, divergences that, as we are going to see now, are reflected in the comrades' conception of the Communist Party. We can define the party as the organizational structure that is articulated around a political line and methods of work and direction in the perspective of directing revolutionary activity towards the creation of social conditions for the taking of political power. From the beginning, it is striking that the first aspect that, for the UCCP, defines the party is its nature as an organizational structure around a political line. This threatens to divert their correct understanding towards organicism. This reduction of the party to a leading organizational apparatus has just been confirmed when the comrades say, the political instrument to achieve this objective is the Communist Party, that is, the ruling apparatus of the revolutionary process in close relationship with the proletariat and the masses interested in social transformation. Here we have just appeared the old conception of the party, dominant during the October cycle, as a political apparatus, as an organization of the vanguard that seeks the political direction of the masses. In this way, the narrow relationship designates two elements fully configured in an external relationship, and not its organic bond, the crystallization of the fusion of the avant-garde and the masses as a party. In reality, the masses are not an external element led by the party but are an integral part of it. If we add to this the characterization they make of that theoretical practice, we have a more complete picture of the ideas of our comrades about the party. The importance of theoretical practice lies in the fact that it provides political practice with the social substance so that the reality represented as an ideology has objectivity. And also, we are sufficiently clear that the determining element in the process of development of the construction of the party is theoretical practice, which implies not only the general understanding of Marxist theory, but above all the development of Marxist theory, its theoretical adaptation to concrete reality. Theoretical practice is never abstract, but concrete, because it is aimed at solving the theoretical and political problems that the revolutionary movement finds to transform social reality. Analysis of social formation to land in the political conjuncture, that is, the synthesis of the existing contradictions, the main and the secondary, and their determination in the class struggle. We had already seen that, if we rigorously applied the ideas of the comrades of the UCCP, that theoretical practice was another way of designating scientific practice, and now we see that, not only does it produce the concept of reality, but that, being the determining element in the process of party construction, it even supplies the social substance and allows us to land in the political situation. In this way, theoretical practice is what develops the organization of the avant-garde and allows it to become a party from the qualitative leap that supposes the production of the concept of reality from the analysis of social formation, landing in the political conjuncture. Thus, the landing in social reality is an internal theoretical scientific process of the avant-garde, theoreticism, which, we suppose, will be facilitated by the links that the avant-garde will have established with the most advanced masses, through opposing that revolutionary alternative in their mobilizations, since this is the other task of the process of reconstruction from the first moment. The problem that immediately appears to us is that, as with the relationship between the vanguard and the masses and the conception of the party as a governing apparatus, here there is no internal, organic link between the tasks related to the reconstitution of the theory and the construction of the links with the masses, but they are parallel, external tasks therefore. This leads us to conclude that, basically, the ideas of the UCCP are not distinguished from the old organicist conception of the party, inherited from the cycle and which dominates among the detachments of the MCI, except for the importance they attach to the theoretical aspect. But, precisely, by understanding this aspect as a fundamentally internal issue of the avant-garde, more related to the analysis of reality than to the ideological struggle, it threatens to fall into the erism, in the face of the narrow practicism that dominates the majority of the MCI. However, this is again, as with right-wing and leftism or objectivism and subjectivism, the other side of the same coin, although, however, their special concern for the theory puts them in better conditions to understand the reconstitution line. We believe that the main reason is that the comrades have not finished perceiving how the unity of theory and practice is manifested in the process of reconstitution. As we say, following the documents of the UCCP, the ideological struggle, the two-line struggle, appears more as an instrument of combat against an external element, revisionism or the bourgeoisie. We had already seen how that theoretical practice produces the ideological elements for that struggle, that is, that are not produced in the same struggle, than as the main engine of internal development, which occupies that theoretical scientific analytical practice. We understand that in this sense, the main criticism that the UCCP has made to us so far can be placed. In this sense, we do not share the opinion of the MAI when they affirm in their document plan for the reconstitution of the Communist Party that the reasons for the disorientation, decomposition and atomization of the communists are the result of the wear and tear that the Marxist theory has suffered after the October period, since it does not allow the ideological reconstitution of communism. For our understanding, it is more accurate to talk about the delay of Marxist theory in terms of the development of social reality, since this theory is also exposed to the struggle of the opposites, to the struggle between the old and the new. We are in favor of approaching the crisis of Marxism from the perspective of its internal contradictions, and not external ones as analyzed by the MAI. However, they conceive of these contradictions as every development process is dominated by the struggle of the opposites, in the case of Marxist theory, between the bourgeois conception and the proletarian conception in the development of capitalist society, between the correct position and the erroneous position of the proletarian avant-garde, between the advanced conception of the avant-garde and the backward position of the masses, etc. Although it is worth mentioning the positive effort to place Marxism as something dialectical, subjected to internal contradictions, and not as something monolithic, static and dead, to which it is usually reduced by dogmatics of all kinds, we understand that this way of seeing it continues the test of that vision, which we have outlined above, of Marxism that our comrades have as a contradiction between science and ideology. It would be an internal contradiction of one's own theory with itself, and not the theoretical expression within Marxism of the class contradiction that capitalist society goes through. This is confirmed when the comrades categorically reject that revisionism can be considered as part of the vanguard. The avant-garde is a practical fact, the result of an action, a political practice in the sense that we have described. We understand that neither revisionism nor opportunism can be considered avant-garde, nor is it the one that simply remains in the Marxist formality of staying in the principles. If a revolutionary political practice is not applied, and it is precisely that revisionism is the manifestation within the Marxist theory of the bourgeois worldview. If we refuse to include revisionism in the category of the avant-garde, we can only understand the contradiction between the bourgeois conception and the proletarian conception in the development of capitalist society as something merely conceptual, intra-theoretical, product of a misuse of the gnoseological instruments of Marxism, understood as a methodology of knowledge. It would be, therefore, the malpractice of the scientist that allows ideological elements to predominate over the analytical scientific ones. However, as we say, revisionism does form a dialectical unit with Marxism, an internal expression in the proletarian ideology of the general class struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. It is the social basis through which this antagonism is expressed within the proletariat. Excluding it means excluding the true element that allows the dialectical development of Marxism as a development of the struggle between its internal contradictions, and, above all, it would be to exclude the practical reference of this same struggle. It means, therefore, not understanding the struggle of two lines as a true engine of internal development of Marxist theory, not understanding that, like everything in the current stage of social matter, Marxism develops from the class struggle. That is precisely the two-line struggle, the theoretical class struggle within the vanguard. This is a key moment, the necessary premise of the constitution of the new type of party. Only this moment and this need to delimit a social land where to implement this struggle already justify the inclusion of revisionism in the avant-garde category. However, it is precisely the organist vision of the party, as well as the formalistic conception of revolutionary theory, that leads the comrades of the UCCP to the demand of a practical action, of concrete direction of some real movement, as if the reconstitution were not, no matter how embryonic its state, a real process and movement, to consider as such the vanguard, because for this conception the organization of the avant-garde is already the party and its direction of the spontaneous. Movement is already a revolutionary direction. That is why the Reconstitution line opposes this understanding of theoretical development as theoretical practice, because it only sees the formal aspect of theoretical activity, its implementation as an analytical methodology of knowledge that, only as a byproduct of that concept of reality, generates the elements for the revolutionary class struggle. Although it may well not do it, as all those academics who have used Marxism as a methodology for studying society have historically demonstrated. That this translates into the development of the revolutionary struggle of the proletariat would then depend on an active will of the social scientist, which, again, brings us closer to subjective idealism, and not on something inscribed in the theory itself, in the form of its development. We believe that the Reconstitution line does identify that key element, which inscribes and organically links the theoretical development of Marxism with the expansion of its radius of social action in the direction of the proletarian revolution, all as a univocal process. Theoretical activity has no social significance by itself. Not even the revolutionary theory develops without that social incidence. To understand the opposite is to conceive of the development of Marxism in a book and intellectualist way, as happened to Althusserian theorism. For this development to be effective, it must be linked to a line of masses. For Marxism, the masses, like everything, are not a static concept, but it is something that is also crossed by internal contradictions. The Reconstitution line reveals this system of contradictions and shows us the way to move forward through it, meaning each advance and expansion of the radius of social influence of the revolutionary theory, which is translated into revolution at all times. Revolutionization of the consciousness of an entire sector of the avant-garde in a first phase, ideological reconstitution of communism, which is what allows that sector to merge with the masses, political reconstitution, that is, of the Communist Party, which is the crystallization of this fusion, in which the masses are an inherent constitutive element, without the which can't be spoken of as a party, revolutionizing its activity and allowing, now yes, the deployment of revolutionary practice that, while revolutionizing circumstances, mass-producing that communist consciousness. The Reconstitution line defends that communist work is always a mass work. What varies is the character of these masses in every moment of the fight. In the current situation of defeat and decomposition of the MCI, when the very foundations of the conception of the revolutionary world are in question, the masses on which the Marxist-Leninist vanguard can and should act at first, which is the one that holds the initiative of the process, precisely because it is the sector that has risen to the understanding of the historical moment and knows how to situate itself in it, concepting it as the interregnum between two revolutionary cycles, are no other than theoretical avant-garde, that is, those sectors that question capitalism and that seek a way out of its historical crisis, and that the requirements and implications of this exit are raised. It is this sector that elaborates the ideas and conceptions that feed the mass movements. This field is made up of revisionism, as well as a whole series of petty bourgeois theories ranging from anarchism to neo-leftism, passing through the entire spectrum of radical postmodern theories. Marxism must measure its weapons with this sector, defeating its conceptions, but also incorporating what can contribute to its ideological reconstitution, denial of denial. The gradual conquest of hegemony within this sector, and we say hegemony because it is not possible to think that revisionism and other theories will disappear as long as the classes subsist, but that, defeated, they will pass to play a secondary role in their inspiration from the social movement, unlike today, where they dominated adopting other forms. The fight against which it will allow the subsequent theoretical development of Marxism is precisely what allows the progressive raising of a referential subjectivity that is a pull of attraction towards the proletarian revolution, and not simply the change of conjuncture as the UCCP seems to propose and denies reality. Since this subjectivity is a social construction and not something inherent to economic development, and will allow to face with guarantees of success the fusion with the practical avant-garde, which is, precisely, the most advanced sector of the masses. Those who, even without considering the global change of the system, are more consistent in the struggle of resistance of the masses, are more critical of the institutional mechanisms of conflict resolution, and whose honesty makes them the natural leaders of the great masses, in whom they place their trust. Having accomplished this merger, we can consider the Communist Party reconstituted, since the internal inclusion of the practical avant-garde of the most advanced sector of the masses guarantees an organic influence among the great masses. From here, culminating the stage of preparation of the revolution with the fusion of the avant-garde and the masses, the second phase of the revolutionary process begins, the revolution itself through the People's War, of the military confrontation between classes. This is why it refers to the social aspect of reconstitution, which, as we see, takes the form of a concentric ring, which is, by the way, perfectly consistent with the form that the revolutionary process takes in the People's War phase, increasingly broader. It is now worth noting the same process observed from the point of view of the theory itself and the way in which it is developed. It is worth remembering at this time what we pointed out above regarding that ontic epistemological unit that Marxism represents. In this sense, referring to his method of knowledge, Marx pointed out, the method that consists of rising from the abstract to the concrete is for thought only the way of appropriating the concrete, of reproducing it as a spiritual concrete. We can see that the theoretical development during the reconstitution process follows a similar course, parallel to its growing social breadth. It is precisely the struggle of two lines within the avant-garde, the line of masses of the reconstitution period, especially in its first phase, conquest of the theoretical avant-garde, that is making revolutionary theory increasingly more concrete. Thus, at first, it is a matter of solving the problems of depth, the deeper implications that the proletarian revolution entails and its uniqueness with respect to the forms of transformation of the preceding world. The main political ideological manifestation of this moment is knurled around the debate around the problems of the general line, which is the most abstract and general political expression of revolutionary theory, the most universal representation of the RPM, of its requirements, phases, and instruments. For the formation of this general line, the balance of the historical experience of the RPM is fundamental and occupies a privileged place, since, as we said, it is the study of the state of the subject, his work and his historical material manifestation. It is from here that the revolutionary subject begins to be socially substantiated as an incipient vanguard movement for reconstitution. And precisely, at the same time that it is faithful to the principles of internationalism, to begin the construction of the subject from the universal and international experience of the RPM, it is what allows us to begin to face the problems of knowledge and analysis of our immediate reality with revolutionary guarantees, precisely for that reason, which we indicated above, that, necessarily, in the social state of matter, any analysis, any concrete research of the immediate, is preceded by a conception of the world. First of all, tending to the general underlying problems of the proletarian worldview and the relationship with its historical application is what ensures that this analysis is guided by and serves the concrete development needs of the revolution. It is what gives us the necessary perspective to objectively frame the knowledge of the world in the process of its transformation, and not simply to adapt it to its spontaneous material development. From this position we have the premise to face the second moment of the reconstitution, the conquest of the practical vanguard. This is the period in which revolutionary theory travels through the space that leads it, characterized by that growing precision, to crystallize as a program, that is, the linkage of the immediate needs of the masses with the establishment of their class dictatorship. The aspect that mediates the proletarian worldview and its first and most general political manifestation as a general line with this program is the political line, which is the application of that worldview and that general line to our specific conditions, that is, the Spanish social formation and the specific state of the class struggle in it. As we say, it is not a merely theoretical process, but is materialized through the struggle of two lines, a manifestation of the unity between theory and practice in the process of reconstitution. This is the mass line and the key to the whole process. As we said above, since the vanguard is a part of social interiority and there is no watchtower that allows us to observe its external, we must make contact, from the totalizing vision that Marxism gives us, with each social sector that is more attached to each particular and partial moment of the whole social, imbue ourselves with its problems and integrate them while we deny their partiality as a moment of the reproduction of that social totality. Denial of denial, for the concrete conformation of that program. This contact crystallizes as the construction of organic links with these social sectors, more or less strong depending on their class nature. Thus we understand, as well as in the process of reconstitution of the party, the being, the ontological, is dialectically linked to the knowledge, the epistemological. It is not from formal analysis that the particularity of social formation is known. Formal analysis is only a moment of this knowledge, but that this knowledge is formed from contact and contrast with the social elements most attached to each plot of that whole. Thus, in this process of struggle, denial and inclusion, it is how the growth, development, of Marxism is being concretized until it crystallizes into a positive program of social revolution. It is this, the process of reconstitution, the true mediation that allows us to land in the conjuncture. This development of growing theoretical concreteness is the ideological expression of the same process of expanding the radius of social influence of the process of reconstitution until culminating in the Communist Party, which is nothing other than the organization of the revolutionary movement, the moment when the revolution is presented as an immediate practical act, the consummation of revolutionary praxis. Thus, it is not that theoretical practice produces the concept of reality from the formal analysis of it, a vision that approaches us dangerously to theoricism, but that the vanguard, through the struggle of two lines, is building organic ties with growing social sectors. From the smallest where we find ourselves, it is in fact the only way coherent with Marxism to get out of the current situation of impotence where the end of the cycle has placed communism, generating the concrete program of revolution at the same time that it produces the subject of this revolution. This also does not mean, of course, that this formal analysis of the immediate reality is out of place at this time. We have pointed out that it is a moment of the production of that knowledge, even if it is not reduced to that. What the reconstitution line gives us is a plan, and the plans are by definition general and schematic. This is no obstacle to the fact that the approach to that specific analysis allows us, dialectically, a better fulfillment of the previous tasks that the complete development of that analysis requires. That exercise is necessary at all times to have a minimum notion of the terrain on which we move. In fact, the MAI, without going any further, in the part of the document that the comrades of the UCCP have used to expose us a first criticism of our positions, elaborated a concrete analysis, still recognizing for the reasons that we have adduced the necessarily limited of it, of the situation of the class struggle in the Spanish state at that time, 2007, to substantiate the proposal that it made at the forefront. In short, it is possible to compare the coherence with which the Reconstitution line understands the process of building the party and its theoretical integrity with the vision proposed to us by the UCCP, and that, as we have seen, divided from the first moment the tasks that we communists face, making it pendulum, it seems to us, between the theorism of theoretical practice and the unionism of the rush to go to mass mobilizations to establish links and opposed line alternatives that are recognized that still have to be elaborated. In our opinion, that vision does not establish organic links between those tasks, so it oscillates between the two without finding the coherence that can make it an effective plan. Finally, after succinctly exposing how the MAI conceives the process of reconstitution of the Communist Party, and from the reflections we have made in this document on the nature of Marxism, it will be better understood that we reaffirm ourselves in considering more suitable the use of the notion of wear and tear, in reference to the criticism, which we have exposed above, that the UCCP made to us regarding the use of this term to define what had happened to Marxist theory during the development of the cycle, proposing the comrades, on the contrary, the term delay. We believe that the term word gives a better account of the substantiveity of the revolutionary subject, how it has been, is, now in absence, which allows capital to camp at ease, and will be a material objective element of the process of social development. As we have seen, the revolutionary action of the proletariat undermined, wore out, its material starting point, that historical correlation of class forces, on which its first revolutionary paradigm was sustained, to which we must add, in addition, the multiple commitments that the development of the class struggle imposed during the cycle, which contributed to introduce and reinforce in Marxism elements unrelated to its internal coherence as a worldview. On the other hand, the word delay reintroduces us into that dualistic vision of the social process as an objective, rather objectivist, process that expels the conscious subject from itself, placing him in his externality and seeming that this objectivity has been moving away in the face of the inability of that subject to know his development. In short, we believe that the first term better evokes dialectical materialism, while the second returns us on the path of the old problem of scientific vulgar materialism. Something more about science and praxis regarding the latter. We would like to make a few final clarifications to make understandable that criticism of the scientism that we have developed a little more in the previous pages. It is absolutely wrong to confuse science with scientism. While the first is a form of social and historically determined consciousness, the highest way of articulating the knowledge that class society has produced, the second is the reduction to science of all valid forms of consciousness, their absolutization. The MAI criticizes the second, but considers that Marxism cannot do without the first. The Reconstitution line insists, in the face of the spontaneous gnosiologicalism that inevitably produces the trade unionist policy in which the majority of the movement is locked, that the formation of communist cadres must be done in science, in the objective knowledge of the laws that govern the matter. But, faithful to historical materialism, he knows that this is a certain form of consciousness and that the appearance of the proletariat in history and the certainty of communist society begin to generate a new and superior conscious form, the revolutionary praxis. This, of course, is also a historically determined form, which requires material, socio-economic, and political requirements for its appearance. The essential premise is the Communist Party, which, in turn, is only possible from the arrival of social matter at a certain stage, characterized by an enormous development of productive forces, capitalism in its decadent phase. We have already seen how precisely capitalism, a social form that engenders modern science, supposes the domination of nature by man. Precisely, that domain is the one that produces the primitive, inferior form of praxis, of the fusion of theory with practice, which is technology. This is where the bourgeoisie has gone the farthest in this dialectical integration. But, precisely, it is an inferior form because it only includes the reproduction of immutable objective material laws, those of nature, in whose conformation, as we said, the subjective aspect has not participated, not admitting the modification of those laws. This is what precisely substances revolutionary praxis as a higher form, since it is no longer just about knowledge, but the transformation of social laws, in whose formation the subject has participated, because humanity has finally arrived. The result of that productive development, tribute to millennia of class society, oppression and exploitation, to the point where these laws can be dominated by the conscious subject, that is, that social matter is on the threshold of self-awareness. Which is nothing more than another way of conceiving communism. However, as long as revolutionaries do not have this superior form of political movement of a new type, we are prevented from deploying that revolutionary praxis. Therefore, to build that movement we must take advantage of the most advanced forms of consciousness that material social development has conquered, that is, science. In addition, the fact that we are incapacitated for the moment for the development of that higher praxis places the forefront, to some extent, and taking into account the limitations that we have pointed out, as an external observer of the spontaneous social process, which justifies a position of consciousness similar to that instituted by science. The difference between science, understood as objective criticism, that position of external observer of an objective process, is that the avant-garde, and the content of its theoretical development, does link this process with an end, communist society, transforming that objective criticism into revolutionary criticism, that is, and the objective demonstration from all possible angles that the development of social matter can finally, and must, lead to that new and superior form of society. In addition, the reconstitution, as we have been insisting, is not only based on this scientific observation of the social process, but takes into account the historically demonstrated material form of realization of that higher praxis, such as the proletarian revolutions of the 20th century. In short, it is taking into account its material premises, the development of the productive forces of capitalism and the Communist Party. How we banish any subjectivism or idealism when it comes to proclaiming revolutionary praxis as a superior form of consciousness, and we give science its just and valuable place, without absolutizing it or characterizing it as what it is not. If we have insisted on the criticism of scientism, it is because it was the dominant deviation in the MCI during the cycle and, therefore, the one that persists the most among its fragmented and confused heirs. In short, if we had to briefly summarize our disagreement with the comrades of the UCCP regarding this issue, from which, in our opinion, the other disagreements are derived, we would say that while for them Marxism is a science, perhaps a revolutionary science, for us it is a revolutionary and scientific conception of the world. That is, while in the first expression science, knowledge, appears as the substantive, for us, although it is part of it, it is not the substance, which is the transformation, the revolution, but an attribute on which that revolution must necessarily be based, but which is not reduced to it, it is a part included in a broader and higher whole. On the path of debate, towards the unity of the Marxist-Leninist vanguard, at the beginning of this work we pointed out the need to promote a public and open debate on the fundamental differences between Marxist collectives and organizations as a fundamental strut to advance in the formation of a proletarian vanguard worthy of the name. This debate does not start now, but has been going on for a long time. However, in recent times, symptoms are accumulating on the table that indicate that the most mature avant-garde sector, which best understands the implications of reconstitution, is growing, both quantitatively and qualitatively, beyond the undoubtedly minority that it continues to be in the movement as a whole. By the way, it must be said very clearly that being a minority is not a problem, but it is a necessary starting position, taking into account the severe state of liquidation through which the MCI passes and the dominance of revisionism in it. Those who boast of their courtships and strikes and demonstrations should not forget that, precisely, since their troops are greater in their influence among the vanguard, their responsibility is also greater in the situation of impotence of the communist movement and in their inability to even demonstrate in the field of politics on a large scale, to influence, no matter how minimal, the general correlation of forces between classes. In this sense that we point out, of growth of the most advanced sector of the avant-garde, it is worth making a small mention of the debate held a few months ago by the UCCP and the Comrades of Revolution or Barbary, ROB, A communist nucleus that is grouping around the website of the same name and that is resolutely committed to promoting the tasks required by the reconstitution of communism. The debate originated in connection with a proposal made by the comrades of the UCCP to favor confluence processes between different communist groups in order to overcome the fragmentation in which this sector of the vanguard is immersed. It talked about the possibility of raising a common organ with the horizon of creating a committee that brings together different groups for a future conference on the construction of the party. The ROB comrades made a first response in which, in our opinion, they very rightly explained the general course of the reconstitution process and, based on this, indicated that they did not see it feasible that the organizational and ideological reunification will take place simultaneously, but they did see it possible in the short term to work for the creation of the means of dissemination that brings together the entire communist vanguard. The rest of the debate can be synthesized around the metaphor that we could call shoes and Marxism. The UCCP, which was the one who coined the expression, pointed out that Marxism is like shoes, which must be comfortable, but, above all, they must allow us to make our way when walking. In his second response, Rob, taking up the happy image, indicated that the current moment is, on the other hand, to search, locate, gather and prepare the right materials to build the right shoes to travel the revolutionary route that we have to travel one day. In our view, this metaphor is quite relevant, and the way it was treated in this debate reflects very well the problems and divergences with the comrades of the UCCP that we have tried to expose throughout this document. Indeed, if Marxism is understood as a methodology of analysis, which the evolution of the October cycle has not affected, always lends itself to substance, it is logical a certain impatience to force groups and confluences. If, on the other hand, as the reconstitution line defends, we understand that theory is inseparable from practice, and that the traumatic end of the revolutions of the 20th century has necessarily had to affect the revolutionary theory that has guided those transformations, a whole period is imposed where the center of gravity is inscribed in the problems proper and substantial of that theory, and, consequently, gives the protagonism of the moment to the social sector, that avant-garde, which is depository and gives body to that theory. In short, it is a matter of knowing if the ideological reconstitution of communism is a necessary and substantial moment of revolutionary rearmament, that search, location and gathering of the necessary materials to make the shoes, or if it is limited to the immediate analysis of reality, the possibility of taking revolutionary steps immediately, which is very consistent with that perspective of winning the most advanced sectors of the masses to revolutionize. The bourgeoisie-proletariat contradiction that we have seen in the UCCP. In this sense, we believe that it is the comrades of Rob who hit the nail on the head. It is not possible, as was possible during the cycle, to give the theory for granted, to assume the theses of the most advanced sectors of the MCI at all times, as, for example, were, at different times, the 21 conditions of the Comintern or Maoism, to immediately go to the great masses, but the revolution demands a moment of specific attention to the theory itself in the light of more than a century of practical revolutionary experience. In any case, this debate is a good example of that growth and vitality of the avant-garde that we point out, to which can be added the appearance of more digital spaces dedicated to reconstruction or the movement that is observed among certain sectors of the communist youth spectrum. It should be noted that these advances are not the result of some table of unity or the grouping of some detachments, but are based on a serious ideological work. That is the most solid foundation possible, what gives the movement long-term projection and what we have to promote from the vanguard. Of course, this does not mean, since it is not about forming a discussion club, that it is not necessary to aim for an organic integration in the more or less short term of this sector. From the MAI we have been pointing out for some time the need to raise a Marxist-Leninist vanguard referent of the anti-revisionist left of the movement that is able to begin to dispute ideological hegemony within the vanguard of revisionism. We have repeatedly indicated that, in our opinion, the basis of this reference, since we still have to reconstitute the theory itself, is political. They are the elements of the general line that the balance of the cycle is making flourish. And, in our opinion, there are already some of them: the understanding of the Communist Party as a fusion of the vanguard and the masses, the People's War as a universal proletarian strategy, the dictatorship of the proletariat as an immediate task of the revolution in the Spanish state. All this, as long as we understand that the unity of action in the defense of this general line must be based on the struggle of two lines, public and open, as a fundamental element of the development of the avant-garde. From this struggle, the ideological differences, more or less large, between the revolutionaries will not derail either their possible unity of action or the general process of reconstitution, and will give it a solidity that will go beyond the specific political or organizational disagreements that may arise between collectives, which so thunderingly tend to abort the unitary processes of the revisionists and that contribute so much to demoralize the movement and to bury it among its suffering militancy the expectations of reconstituting the party. It must be insisted, to avoid misunderstandings, that the immediate horizon of development that opens before the avant-garde is very far from being the reconstitution of the party, which is something that does not arise from voluntary units, but is the unity of the Marxist-Leninist avant-garde, which is a premise for the development of the rest of the reconstitution process. In this sense, we do believe that there is common ground to move towards this goal with the comrades of the UCCP. Although, as we have seen, there are profound fundamental divergences in the understanding of Marxism, we believe that there is a willingness to treat them in a serious and well-founded way, and there is also a political identity in many points. Thus, the comrades of the UCCP have said on several occasions that for them the Marxist theory is the director of the revolutionary process, not the spontaneity of the masses. They understand that the pending revolution in Spain is the socialist one, not some intermediate democratic bourgeois republican phase, and they seem to defend the People's War as a proletarian strategy. All these are very positive points, although, perhaps, it is missing to give content to some of them, such as, for example, in the case of the People's War, which, at least in the documents of the comrades we know, we have not seen very defined. Likewise, many of the UCCP's criticisms of revisionism are absolutely correct, such as, for example, its understanding of the state as a charitable and neutral entity that protects us from the evil market, extending that negative judgment to republicanism, the traditional standard bearer of those conceptions in these parts. They also very rightly point out the traditional oversight in the fight against economicism that has presided over the activity of the avant-garde in this country. In addition, as we have pointed out, despite the profound divergences indicated, the special concern of the comrades of the UCCP for the theory places them in better conditions to understand the reconstitution line and leads them to pose problems that, although we understand from another perspective, are not trivial, such as, for example, the need to move from that voluntary assumption and elaboration of the proletarian ideology to creating the conditions for this to be a systematic, institutionalized activity, as the comrades say. If we have focused on the negative aspect, on the criticism of what separates us, that is precisely why we have been insisting on the role that the two-line struggle plays in the process of reconstitution. If, beyond the more or less fortunate of our criticism, we have managed with this debate to contribute to the development of the avant-garde, to the implementation of this struggle, all our possible mistakes will not have been in vain. Anti-Imperialist Movement, April 2013.